So all the committee members are here. Good. I call this meeting to order. Welcome everyone to meeting number 34 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. Pursuant to an order of reference on Tuesday, May 4th, 2021, the committee is meeting to study Bill C-12. This is our third and last meeting with witnesses, and then next week we dive into the clause-by-clause amending process. I know all the members know the modus operandi for committee meetings, but for any witness who has not appeared before a parliamentary committee during COVID, that we just ask that you put yourself on mute when you're not speaking, and when you are speaking, that you address the committee through the chair. So today we have 4 witnesses in the first half, and then 5 in the second. We have with us as witnesses as individuals, we have David Wright, associate professor at the law faculty of the University of Calgary. We have Professor Corinne Lecquéré from East Anglia, University of East Anglia, and she's in the process, I believe, of joining the call. We have Tara Peel from the Canadian Labour Congress, and we're expecting Mr. Toby Heaps from Corporate Knights. So why don't we start with Mr. Wright for 5 minutes, please?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to all members of the committee. My name is David Wright, and I am an assistant professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Calgary. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak with you today on this topic. And let me begin by saying that it's refreshing to speak about climate with you today, because the weather in Calgary is absolutely putrid. It's solid state precipitation in single digits, so better to focus on climate today. By way of background, my research is focused on environmental and natural resources law with an emphasis on climate change. I'm a professor, but also a lawyer, having been called to the bars of Nova Scotia, Nunavut, and Northwest Territories. And I've been engaged in this field of climate law and policy for about 15 years or so. I was also with the Office of the Federal Commissioner of Environment and Sustainable Development for 5 years, from 2011 to 2016. And so I note with interest the revived role the commissioner set out in C-12. So turning to C-12, I'll begin by saying that, in my view, the bill represents a significant step forward in Canadian climate law and policy. It provides a much needed basis for better coherence across the law and policy landscape. However, there are clearly areas for improvement. So my brief opening comments to you today will focus on 3 areas. 1, federal provincial jurisdiction. 2, justiciability. And 3, the role of the commissioner. So on jurisdiction, in practical terms, as you all know, Canada's constitution is silent with respect to environmental matters, including climate change, and that results in overlapping jurisdiction between federal and provincial governments. The federal government does have ample jurisdiction to act on climate change, to address climate change, and presently exercises that in a number of ways, including carbon pricing, as the Supreme Court spoke to just weeks ago. The federal government also occupies a unique vantage point with respect to coordinating all jurisdictions of the Federation. However, as the minister noted in his opening remarks to this committee on Monday, the federal government can't impose a top-down decarbonization agenda. It cannot, for example, compel provinces to take on any specific emission reduction targets. As such, a climate accountability statute like this can only go so far in terms of detailing what the entire Federation can do to achieve Canada's emission reduction commitments. It's clear that C-12 was carefully drafted with a view to these constitutional and jurisdictional constraints. A lot of the provisions focus almost entirely on, quote, federal measures. However, even with these constraints, in my view, C-12 can be improved in several ways that still respect these jurisdictional lanes. First, the bill ought to be amended to make information about measures undertaken by provinces and territories a mandatory part of the emission reduction plan required under Section 10, and I can elaborate on that in the Q&A. And second, and similarly, I suggest adding explicit mandatory requirements for the progress reports and assessment reports that include contributions of the provinces and territories to greenhouse gas emission reductions. So to be clear, Those suggestions would impose no obligation on provinces, just information gathering activities on the part of the federal government. And there's certainly no jurisdictional or constitutional barrier to that. And again, in Q&A, I can get into the rationale behind those suggestions. On justiciability, the key question here really is the extent to which Bill C-12 includes or invites accountability through judicial scrutiny and remediation, in addition to the obvious political, parliamentary, and public accountability woven into the proposed regime. In short, there's unpredictability on this front given the bill's present form. So the key question for this committee and for those engaged in revising the bill, and I don't envy your line-by-line task next week, is the extent to which such unpredictability ought to be managed and the extent to which it can be managed. And so here's what I mean. It's fairly simple to clear this up by including an explicit provision that provides for judicial review and remedies with respect to any obligations under the Act. And I understand that the committee's received several proposals on this. It's a relatively straightforward option. I do recommend it, and it would virtually eliminate the justiciability concerns that you've been hearing about. From there, though, things get a little bit more complex. The alternatives are complicated, and that's really engaging in amendment to specific provisions to at least reduce the basis for a court to find all or part of the Act not justiciable. As you're likely aware, there's a federal court case on point on this matter in dealing with the Kyoto Protocol Implementation Act, and that decision was affirmed by the Federal Court of Appeal. In the interest of time, I won't go into details and I'll leave it to Q&A, but the upshot really is that the duties in the bill need to set out clear mandatory language that provide courts objective legal criteria to be applied. The bill does a reasonably good job of that, better than CAPIA did, but several provisions could be improved. On a final note, with my final seconds on the role of the commissioner, in my view, revival of this independent oversight role is a welcome feature of Bill C-12. The Office of the Commissioner is a strong, credible, high-capacity office that can add value and contribute to the proposed transparency and accountability regime. I do have a few small suggestions on that front, though, in relation to Section 24. So in conclusion, in my view, C-12, if it became law, would be an important, laudable step that will improve coherence across Canadian climate law and policy. However, as currently structured, it may not fully withstand shifting political winds, and really that is the intention behind this initiative. So in this way, the bill as proposed may not live up to expectations. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Wright. Je vois que Madame Lequéré s'est joint à nous.
I believe Ms. Quéré has joined us. Welcome once again, Professor Lequéré. I think this is not the first time you've appeared before the committee. So I would ask you to please share with us your opening remarks. You have about 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I apologize, I had some technical problems.
Merci de me donner la parole aujourd'hui. J'aimerais dire quelques mots sur la gouvernance des actions climatiques du Canada qui, de fait, n'ont pas fonctionné par le passé. Je travaille au Royaume-Uni et
on this question, and the bill C-12 actually needs to guarantee that current climate objectives will be met. And I think, you know, in this committee, I flagged it when I was here in March that Canada is the only G7 countries whose emissions did not decrease in the past decade prior to COVID. And the COVID crisis has led to a temporary decrease in emissions, but because these are not structural decreases, as soon as the confinement lifts, the emission will come back up, possibly even above the previous levels. However, on the good side, experience of the last 15 years show that many countries have successfully implemented sustained cuts in emission. And I mentioned I have worked in the UK. I've also worked in France, in the past country. And what I've done in preparation for this meeting is compare the corresponding bills to Bill C-12 with the bills that are in place in the UK, the Climate Change Act, and in place in France, the Energy Climate Bill. And there I find ways that the Bill C-12 could be considerably strengthened to play its role now in 2021 in making the emissions curb in Canada. And there are mainly two directions in which I think the Bill C-12 could be strengthened. First, by injecting a sense of urgency and clear signals to the population. And second, by strengthening the independence of the advice received by government. On the first point, Bill C-12 has little sense of urgency and misses out on clarity of the signals. And this is really important to guide private sector investments. The objective of pace of governance is too slow to deliver, particularly on the 2030 targets, but also on the longer targets. And this could be rectified by reporting on progress every year to maintain clear and up-to-date picture of progress so far or the lack of. Set a milestone for this decade, so a milestone for 2025 or 2026, not wait for 2030. This is too far for sending a signal. Determine milestones at least 10 years in advance. Both France and the UK determine their milestone 12 years in advance, and the private sector knows long ahead what is the direction of travel, and base milestone levels on the advice of the Net Zero Advisory Group. On the second point, expert, independent, evidence-based advice is critical to making this bill work. Critical evidence-based advice takes into account not only the global constraints like the net zero target for 2050 does, but as well as national circumstances. What is the starting point? The fact that Canada is a federation, and this comes with a set of constraints, the very specific fuel mix of Canada, which is different from that of the United States, the UK, and many other countries. This can and will be an ally for the implementation of action by the government and the parliament. This point could also be considerably strengthened in Bill C-12, in particular by mandating the members of the net advisory body to be based on their expertise and not a representation. What you want is these people there for their insights, and by providing sufficient and protected resources for operations to both the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development, who makes the assessment of what has happened up to now, and to the advisory body, who will make a recommendation for policy forward. I want to end by saying that Canada has made a great step forward with this new climate target for 2030, net zero objective for 2050, but it has a poor track record internationally in delivering on climate change. Is very visible, and it damages Canada. And Bill C-12 and its implementation of climate action, it will trigger, it is very timely to rectify this course. Thank you very much.
Merci, Professor Lequerré.
Thank you, Professor Lequerré. Next, we have with us from the Canadian Labour Congress, the Health, Safety and Environment Coordinator, Tara Peel. Ms. Peel, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear here before you today. The Canadian Labour Congress is Canada's largest central labour body. It advocates on national issues on behalf of more than 3 million working people from coast to coast to coast. Climate change is a vitally important issue for unions and all working people in Canada. That's why the CLC and Canada's unions welcome the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. In the limited time I have, I will confine my remarks on the legislation to 3 areas: accountability mechanisms in Bill C-12, just transition, and the Net Zero Advisory Body. First, with respect to accountability, as others have said before me, Canada has never met a single climate target that it has set for itself. In order to break this pattern of missed greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets, we need a law that holds governments accountable for meeting its milestones, not for trying to meet them. Bill C-12 requires a rolling cycle of planning and reporting against the 5-year milestones and the long-term targets. However, the bill provides too much leeway to set weak targets and issue plans with few details. The Act should set clear and firm obligations on the minister to meet or exceed robust minimum standards when setting targets and establishing emissions reductions plans. These plans need to contain robust modeling clearly demonstrating how the targets will be met. Accountability must be results-driven, not process-driven. Additionally, there are inadequate accountability checkpoints in the crucial next decade. Bill C-12 uses milestone targets rather than carbon budgets. Compounding this, the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development is required to prepare reports on the implementation of measures only once every 5 years. Now that the government has set a target for 2030, there's no justifiable reason not to hold the government accountable in 2025. Finally, in order to remain aligned with the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit on warming, this legislation must require absolute reductions in greenhouse gas emissions rather than relying on carbon offsets and hopeful technological solutions that will allow industry to continue to generate rising emissions. I turn now to just transition. The CLC appreciates the job creation focus that went into developing Bill C-12, and we don't expect this legislation to achieve all of the goals of the promised just transition legislation. However, in our view, this bill should contain specific references to just transition as an important driver of climate ambition. Concrete just transition plans for affected workers and communities are essential, not only so that we can include the workforce. And then finally, on the Net Zero Advisory Body, this body is an important component of the bill, there's no question. It is comprised of representatives of diverse communities, including Indigenous communities, the government, the labor movement, environmental organizations, industry, and academia, all with their own expertise. We are pleased that the CLC President Hassan Youssef will represent workers on the advisory body. In our view, though, the Net Zero Advisory Body must be positioned to provide strong science-based guidance on pathways to achieving the 5-year milestones. While the advisory body will provide important guidance on measures and strategies for meeting Canada's emissions reduction milestone, there's currently no clear role for the advisory body in monitoring, assessing, and reporting on progress towards meeting Canada's targets. In our view, there should be independent and frequent detailed assessment of whether Canada is on track to meet its targets. The CLC welcomes this legislation, which has the potential to change Canada's history of never having met our climate targets. By strengthening certain areas of the bill, it could put Canada on track to meaningfully contribute to the crucial efforts to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Peel. We'll now go to Mr. Toby Heaps, President and CEO and co-founder of Corporate Knights.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks.
Do you have a headset, Mr. Heaps?
No, I do not.
Oh, this is unfortunately we have to for the health and safety of the interpreters. We must have witnesses must have headsets. Do you have earpods or something like that that might give appropriate sound quality? Or it's just that the House and committees of the House have passed resolutions on this issue.
Sorry, I don't. I just learned of this last night. I didn't.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could follow the discussion and send us any comments, Madam Clerk. What do you suggest? Do you have any suggestions? I mean, we passed a motion to the effect that we cannot proceed because we need interpretation. So and the interpreters need for the witnesses to have the appropriate gear. Any suggestions, Ms. Madam Clerk?
Monsieur le Président.
Oui.
Mr. Chair. Indeed, I find this very unfortunate. Usually, if I recall properly in the motion, it says that when we can't have translation, we ask the witness to come back at another time, except that we don't have another time for that appearance. Since we're at the last day of hearing from witnesses. So I don't want to compromise the interpreter's health and safety either, so I think there's no choice here. No, indeed, we've adopted something. We can't put his presentation off to another time because that's what we decided in the motion that was adopted.
We have a second panel later this afternoon. Is there any chance that you can get some earbuds or some kind of?
Yeah, I can work that out by this afternoon.
Well, by this afternoon, I mean in about an hour.
Yeah, I think I can manage that.
Okay, so we'll just try and squeeze you in the second panel.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay. Ça va, Madame Posé, ça va, cette solution?
Does that solution suit you, Ms. Posé? Yes? Madam Clerk? Does that seem to be an acceptable solution? Yes. Okay. Well, pardon me.
Speaking, yes.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
Mr. Chair.
sorry, Madam Ms. May.
No, I'm not, as you know, very evidently not a member of the committee. I find it really regrettable that a bill this important has only 3 sessions for witnesses. I'm wondering if there is, and I just ask committee members to consider if a day couldn't be added to ensure that, I mean, this is a really important piece of legislation, and obviously we're really pressed for time to hear a range of witnesses. I put some names forward, and obviously they weren't chosen, but I've just asked committee members to consider maybe they could add more time.
I believe all the suggested witnesses. We looked at all the suggested witnesses, did we not, Madam Clerk? They were all on that list.
They were all sent to the analysts for a consideration for the panels.
But they were on the sheet that I saw and everyone saw.
Well, I of course I didn't see it, but I did suggest I send in a list of witnesses, and none of them are on the panels.
Okay.
I'll leave it to another time. I don't want to take precious time.
But the committee did decide on 9 hours of witness hearings. I mean, obviously, the committee can always change its mind. If somebody has a motion, I guess, it'll be up to them to present it. But for now, I think
we proceed, Mr.
Yeah, we
Chair.
proceed. So, so we'll have to proceed. So, do we go? I guess we go straight to questions at this point. And that'll leave a bit longer for the second panel because we have 6 witnesses now. Okay, so we start with Ms. McLeod. Is that correct?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. And hopefully we do get a chance to hear from Mr. Heaps in the next panel, although, of course, it will then cut our opportunity for questioning a little bit shorter. I'm going to start with Mr. Wright. And, one thing, I have spent the last 5 years on the Indigenous Committee, and I have spent very little time on this particular committee. But what has been quite stunning to me is, first of all, when the officials indicated that there had been no dialogue with Indigenous peoples in Canada prior to the tabling of this piece of legislation. So if you look at the UN Declaration, which the government says is a very important piece of legislation that they're moving forward, you look at Section 19 that talks about the need to have those sorts of dialogues on important issues to Indigenous peoples. So I guess my question, first of all, to you is, does this surprise you that there was no sort of formal consultation or conversation with Environment Canada? And is it appropriate, given the fact that the current government has said there's no more relationship that is so important, and the fact that they're moving the UN Declaration through? To me, it talks symbolism, but it doesn't talk reality in terms of things that make a difference.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Not an aspect I anticipated speaking about today, but I welcome the question. And to be completely candid, I have not been tracking that aspect of the bill's development. I do recall the minister mentioning discussions with some of the representative Indigenous bodies and organizations on Monday to some degree, but I haven't been following that, so I can't say. I mean, from a legal perspective, the case law is somewhat uneven, but relatively clear on the point that there's no duty to consult in the formulation of legislation. And so we're probably not in the realm of being offside of the law, but as you say, commitments to implement the UN Declaration go beyond what the current law requires in Canada, and it's evolving and becoming law. And so I would expect as the bill's development and refinement moves forward, and particularly as plans are then issued under the law, if it becomes law, there would be robust collaboration and cooperation and consultation with Indigenous communities and those representative Indigenous organizations.
And I think one of the areas that we've had a lot of conversation about over the time frame and the witnesses that we've had is, number one, that there has been the advisory committee, the net zero committee has already been struck, but even today we're hearing, some different perspectives in terms of should it be a scientific body versus should it be a representative body. And so, I guess number one, it was unfortunate that the government did not sort of wait to hear from the experts in terms of, what that should look like, and have just proceeded in terms of, as I say, some very important people who are very well thought of throughout Canada, but is it the actual right mix in terms of what we need to move forward? And then again, I'm going to go to the Indigenous piece in terms of there's nothing that speaks to, yes, there has been some representation chosen, but there's nothing that compels the government to do so. So again, any comments on that general issue, and again, Indigenous peoples' participation in this kind of net zero advisory group panel?
Sure. Yes. Thanks for that question as well. So a couple things. I guess you have to start somewhere when it comes to putting together the institutional supports that this regime requires. And so it's not all that surprising that the minister did put together this group, apparently on a volunteer basis, from what I understand, on Monday. And then if the bill becomes law, one would expect probably a more robust process, and probably revisions to the terms of reference, and perhaps within that, some kind of competency matrix to make sure it does have the right makeup. And hopefully that would be based on some of the helpful input this committee's been receiving about the importance of diverse expert individuals and roles. One option on that front, though, would be to look at some of the new provisions in the Federal Impact Assessment Act and Canada Energy Regulator Act, which do explicitly require a minimum of one Indigenous person to serve on different advisory and expert bodies. So that could be detailed at the statutory level, or it could be detailed at the below statute level in the terms of reference or a similar instrument. And so that may be a recommendation that this committee wants to consider. It may be a level of detail deeper than this statute goes, but it could be achieved again at statute level or at the guidance in terms of reference level.
Still some time, Chair.
Well,
I know yesterday
seconds.
I kept going when I shouldn't have.
15 seconds if you can make a statement.
So my statement being, I am surprised at the, distinct lack of any kind of formal process with the Environment Canada in terms of that particular Indigenous inclusion, given the priority in terms of relationships and the UN Declaration. Thank you.
Merci. Alors, on passe maintenant à Monsieur Longfield.
Thank you. We now go to Mr. Longfield.
Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. Mr. Wright, I'd like to continue with you. There's a few areas that I've been concerned with as I'm reading the legislation. One in particular is with the relationship, the constitutional relationship we have with provinces and territories. You mentioned in your testimony about the balance between setting legislation that has achievable targets, but not imposing targets directly on the provinces and territories in terms of numbers. Could you expand on that just a little bit? You mentioned that you could add a little bit of detail.
Sure, thanks for the question. So at a general level, of course, there are jurisdictional constraints flowing from the Constitution with respect to how far the federal government can go. Only has so many constitutionally based levers to pull. And the present government has been using almost all levers available. That does not get the country all the way to achieving the emission reductions required. It can go a significant way, but not all the way. And so there is no option other than to cooperate with provinces and across provinces and territories. And so the specific change I suggest to the bill is moving the permissive portion of 10 sub 3 up to the mandatory portion of 10 sub 1. That, to get away from the numbers and technical, basically making the information on contributions of provinces and territories to emission reductions a mandatory part of the plans required under Section 10.
Yep.
And you could leave the rest permissive under 10 sub 3, although there's a sensitive territory to cover there with respect to Indigenous governments as well.
Great. Thank you. That's very helpful. I see exactly what you're talking about there. And that will be helpful as we do clause by clause. So that's why I said, refer to sections, because we will be doing that in our next meetings. Also, the advisory board. I've been involved with not-for-profits. I've helped set up boards. Conflict of interest is always a concern. Sometimes you write that into the bylaws that you have to leave your business at the door, but even then you have to be, if you're representing your business on a board, you have to be very careful about the conflict of interest and management of those. So the composition of the board itself, or the advisory body, it's being called in the legislation. How could you see us drawing from the skill sets that we need to draw from, particularly, let's say, on interprovincial relations with the federal government? But also as businesses, we've had some lobbying organizations say, include me in the panel, I want to be on the panel. How would we manage the conflicts?
Sure. Easier said than done. Devil is always in the detail, to offer a few platitudes. I mean, one option is to, first of all, make it explicit. So legislative intent signaling that, conflict of interest is a live issue that will be safeguarded against. Again, there's helpful language on that front in the recently amended Canada Energy Regulator Act. And then it'd be a matter of systems and practices to safeguard against that. Disclosure can go a long way. And so as long as actual or perceived conflicts are disclosed and everyone consents to that, and that's sort of the price of admission to this expert's view, then all can be above board and well.
Right. It's always the disclosure piece. I've had to do that many times myself. When it comes to the Auditor General's office and the role of the Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development, I also sit on the Public Accounts Committee, as does our clerk, serve that committee. We look at the action items coming from the audits as a very key part of the information that we work with. The action items are an early report that does come to Parliament, because that office does report to Parliament, not to government. There's a governance piece there that I'd like to make sure that we highlight in the legislation of the key role that audit team provides, including identifying action items when you're not meeting targets that you've been given through legislation.
Yes, so the way this would likely work in the offices of the Environment Commissioner, and I'm speaking from my present vantage point, not my previous vantage point, is these would likely be performance audits, so value for money audits, non-financial audits. Within that scope or that area of the Commissioner's work, there are, as you say, recommendations issued. The way to perhaps modify Bill C-12 to ensure you get the meaningful recommendations that you're looking for, assuming everybody wants us to be as strong on the transparency and accountability front as possible, would mean including language probably closer to that proposed in Bill C-215, proposed in February 22 by the Bloc Québécois Party, that tied it to looking at actually achieving the emission reductions targets. The present language in 24 is relatively loose. And so there is some text to revisit and pluck perhaps from C-215.
But the government has invested in that office to get some specialists in environmental audits. So that piece would be done. It's just the accountability and transparency that you're saying we need to strengthen.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very helpful.
Mr. Longfield. Est-ce que c'est Madame Michaud?
Is it Madame Michaud or Ms. Posé? Yes, thank you very much to the witnesses for being with us here this afternoon. I would begin with you, Dr. Le Carré. You are a member of the council in France, and you are part of the IPCC, and so it's wonderful for us to be able to hear your thoughts. I've had the opportunity to hear you several times over the last few months when you came, for example, to testify last March to give us your advice. But there doesn't seem to be any interest for the suggestion that you made then. So my question would be the following. The role of the commissioner is looking to the past, but the expert panel should be looking to the future. So in your opinion, Dr. Le Carré, what do you see as the future if the advisory board stays as it is, and how would the progress be compromised? Thank you, Madame Posé. Indeed, at this point in time, the proposed legislation is quite weak in terms of the follow-up of measures that have been put in place. And this is really the work of the Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development. And so this person is only asked to look at this every 5 years. There's no reason why we should wait so long to have a follow-up on the policies and measures that have been put in place in order to be able to rectify quite quickly the direction that things are taking. And indeed, to give the Commissioner of the Environment a bigger role, an independent officer of Parliament could perhaps bring more independence to that person so that the Commissioner could really be able to choose their own technical team and organize their work more independently. And in fact, then pay more attention to the results rather than just to expenses overall. Thank you. So somewhat in the same direction, you were part of a panel with alongside Lord Dimon, who chairs the Climate Change Committee in the UK. And you also talked about intersectorial issues in the area of climate. So you spoke indeed about a consultative or an advisory body and have that under the Commissioner of the Environment rather than reporting to the Minister. So do you think that that would make an approach that would put all of the decisions taken through this kind of analysis really of the environment? Yes, absolutely. I believe that the current design of this legislation, this draft legislation, the advisory body is too close to the minister, and the independence is not visible enough. It's what you would call arm's length in English. So that's not very visible in this. It's too close to the government and too far away from the Commissioner of the Environment, who is following up on these politics. So if those two functions could be brought closer together, that is to say, those that look back with those that look forward, supported by a very strong technical team that could both analyze the failures of the past and support that advisory board looking forward. So this would be in terms of the past reports and future recommendations, and they would both be stronger for it. Yes, but would it allow for, in France you spoke, I think, or perhaps last week it was, to ensure that all of the decisions made by the government would be analyzed in light of these environmental objectives? Yes, indeed. The point that we find ourselves at with the implementation of climate policies, all of the government's decisions must go through this analysis of climate-related objectives. So we can see what the government wants to do in general in this way. And so the legislation really must allow or must provide a framework for decisions that are not necessarily specifically dealing with climate and the environment, but they'd have to be just as strong and taking into account our carbon reality. Thank you very much. And now, in your opening statement, you said we have to talk about the urgency of this. And I think that's clear to us. So under C12, you said that there are several critical shortcomings in terms of accountability and long-term issues and the achievement of those long-term objectives, rather. So in terms of transparency, what would you say, because you talked a little bit about this, but to have more frequent reports, for example? Yes, absolutely. What really works in the UK and in France is that every year the two committees, the one that I chair in France and the one that I sit on in the UK, get together in June and publish a report that does say, indeed, what has moved forward during the course of the year and where there were shortcomings, department by department in each country, etc. And the government has to reply quite quickly to these annual reports. So that allows for the urgency of the situation to be in the forefront and for very quick reactions to changing course. So we can't keep that rhythm up if reports are tabled every 5 years. Thank you very much, Dr. Lequerry. Thank you, Ms. Posey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I heard my name called there. Thank you to all of the witnesses. This has been a fascinating and very important conversation. My first question is for Mr. Wright. You talked a little bit about the role of the commissioner, and Professor Lequerry also spoke to this in some detail. My question is whether the officer of the Environment Commissioner, as it's currently set up, is adequately structured and resourced to perform an expanded role, or whether it not only needs to be made an independent officer of Parliament, but also resourced in a much stronger way so that it can take care of what it could be tasked with under an expanded C12.
Sure. Thank you for the question. It's hard to speak to resources, and I will just openly say I'm somewhat biased. I think that office deserves more resources. I think that their role as an independent oversight body is a valuable one, and that they would benefit from additional resources. I think what you may be getting at is the relatively circumscribed role of the office, though, and this was alluded to earlier, in that it is a retrospective role that it plays. It really answers the question of how's it been going, and does not answer the question of how ought it go. And so the office does not have the authority to look at the merits of pathways forward. Mm-hmm. And so there's a broader institutional structure question, which would require broader amendments, frankly, to the Auditor General Act that would modify that role to adopt that sort of question the merits type of approach. And that's been debated since the inception of the office back in the 90s. And so that's, again, a broader discussion, perhaps for here, or perhaps not from here. But there is, I think, the last thing I would say is perhaps a missing piece here, right? So you've got the retrospective fairly well covered, although I would also suggest more frequent reports, probably 2 per 5-year period. That's one of the amendments to Section 24, not once per. But the missing piece is that prospective role that is perhaps a bit more distance from the minister to the previous point. That role under the Kyoto Protocol Implementation Act was performed by the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy. The current Institute for Climate Change Choices fulfills some of that, but not all of that. And so there is, again, an institutional, probably missing piece here that ought to be discussed by this committee and thought through, because institutions matter in terms of holding governments to account.
Thank you. You also spoke a little bit about justiciability, and at the risk of making either of us say that word more times than we have to, I wonder if you could expand a little bit on the changes, apart from the amendment that would put specific reference to judicial review into C12, what the other changes in language that you feel as a lawyer would be important in terms of the enforceability and potential future legal challenges under the Act.
Yes, thanks for that question. And yet, so there is simple option A and complicated option B. So we're now on to complicated option B. So one suggestion is to amend section 10 sub 1, that's the contents of the plan provision, to make it more detailed and more prescriptive. And so this committee has heard proposals about explicit reference to modeling and projections. I would recommend that as well. And generally, the more detail, the better, because what, again, you're trying to set up in this statute is objective criteria that can be embraced by a court, interpreted by a court, and applied by a court, so the court's not forced to move out of its comfort zone into determining policy matters. The other specific one is to add language to the effect of Canada or the federal government having a duty, or the minister having a duty to, quote, take all necessary measures to achieve the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets established under this act and elsewhere. So those specific words, and I heard earlier, I think this morning or yesterday, words really do matter. Taking all necessary matters has been judicially interpreted in Canada, has been interpreted and linked to a matter being justiciable. And so that may be helpful. And what form that may take is actually a new section, probably a new section 9 following section 8, that is devoted to clarifying that there's a duty to take all necessary measures to achieve the targets that have been committed to.
Thank you very much. Turning now to Professor Leclerc. We've heard from many witnesses about the need for a near-term milestone prior to 2030. I wonder if you could speak to the risk that we run if we don't see a near-term milestone established within C12. What is the risk of not having that?
The risk is that the urgency is not recognized. You have a milestone for 2030, and you're going to have to very quickly establish a pathway for that milestone. And you're in your midterm, so having a milestone then in 2025 makes it very obvious to all your actors across society, particularly the private sector, what is it that they have to do to assist in that pathway. And I think that this is extremely important. 2030 is way too far, especially if the reports of the commissioner are going to come as slow as every 5 years.
You've done a lot of thinking about this. If you were going to put in a 2025 milestone and assign a target to it, percentage-wise, what would that be?
Very, very quickly, because we're over time.
I would ask the Net Zero Advisory Body to tell me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting questions and answers. We'll go to the second round, starting with Mr. Albus for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all of the witnesses, but I actually am going to be passing my time on to MP May.
MP May.
And I am grateful and actually surprised, but thank you again, Dan. I want to start with Professor Leclerc. Put my interpretation channel on. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to speak. You're very familiar, obviously, with the UK legislation and the French legislation on climate accountability. Would it be unfair of me to ask you about other nations' climate accountability laws, such as New Zealand's, other countries that, and I put to you, so if you're nodding, so it's not unfair. I'd ask you the question, is Canada alone in the world at this point in bringing in climate accountability legislation with the first milestone year that's a decade after passing the legislation? It seems to me that New Zealand, UK brought in a first accountability moment within 5 years of the legislation passing.
That is certainly the case for the countries that I know, that the first objective is almost, in fact, too close, that France has set up an objective with the starting year at the year the legislation was passed. And because of the sense of urgency that this brought, and that has been actually really helpful to try to accelerate action indeed.
Yeah, and also to looking at all the other countries' legislation, it seems to me that there's a preference right around the world to having a body that's arm's length from the minister in question, that is designed around the expertise of the individuals serving on that body and which rests very soundly on science as opposed to political objectives. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely, that's a fair statement, particularly the element of expertise. You want the people to sit on that panel to bring what they know that works about climate change. And if you start to have representation, then you don't have an advisory body, you have a consultation body.
Thank you. I want to turn to Ms. Peel from the Canadian Labour Congress. I don't think we've paid enough attention to the just transition piece. And I want to ask her particularly about I'm assuming I'm still right that Ms. Peel is here, about the work that was done by the coal sector, a special body on co-chaired by Hassan Youssef. Do you think we can do much with just transition within the rubric of C12, or we really need to get going and have a separate piece of legislation brought forward?
Well, you know, in the absence of that piece of legislation being brought forward, some recognition of that in C12, I think, is important. When this climate accountability legislation was announced, the indication was that we would be setting 5-year milestones while at the same time bringing in just transition legislation to ensure a just transition of the workforce. And so in the absence of that legislation being introduced, we need something in this legislation to ensure that that is a component of the planning and the monitoring and the reporting and actually meeting those milestones.
That's excellent. Thank you. Professor Wright, I wanted to get to the origins of the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development. I'm pretty sure I shouldn't say I'm the only one. I'm sure that our chair remembers the 1993 Liberal Red Book, which promised that we would have. Yeah, I know we're the only ones here who remember all those hearings when Charles Tascher chaired the Environment Committee. And we discussed what are we going to do to create a Commissioner for the Environment and Sustainable Development. And the idea of putting it within the Office of the Auditor General was somewhat controversial. Would that be enough? Would that work? Given what we've learned over the decades, Professor Wright, would you, I'll put it forward, I think we should have an independent environmental commissioner that reports to Parliament as opposed to being inside the Office of the Auditor General. Do you have a view on that?
It's a huge multi-decadal question, Ms. May, as you know. It's complicated and goes in both directions. So one of the benefits of having the Commissioner office in the Office of the Auditor General is it's well-resourced, it has lots of bench strength, it does not engage in policy debates, and so is able to sort of build and maintain credibility on that front. And that has also insulated the Commissioner's office from the political winds. So for example, in the cuts under the Harper administration years ago, NRT was cut, the Commissioner's office was not cut, although perhaps some resources were reduced. Those are all benefits of the existing model. If that mandate is cracked open and amended in a significant way, some of those benefits may get eroded or taken away. And so you really have two options. One is, as you say, to expand the office and create it as a completely independent agent of Parliament or officer of Parliament. The other is to create a new separate institution that is in the likeness of, as you've all been discussing, so an NRT 2.0, if you will, National Roundtable on Environment and Economy 2.0.
Yeah, I think that's one of the losses with the loss of the National Roundtable. I think C12 is weakened by essentially putting in a mini roundtable of multi-stakeholder concerns instead of an expert group. If we could recreate the National Roundtable, that's another topic for another day. How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair?
10 seconds.
Oh, 10 seconds. Okay, I thank Dan Alvis again.
Thank you. Mr. Saini.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses that are here today. It's really great to have all of you here and hear your different perspectives. Let me start with you, Mr. Wright, Professor Wright, sorry. You talked about coherence at the domestic level, but in November, you wrote a blog post, and I quote, that the bill creates the direct link between international climate change reporting requirements and the domestic regime. Could you expand on this?
Yes, thanks for the question. So As you all know, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, Canada has a number of regular reporting obligations in the form of annual emissions inventories, for example, biennial reports that include projections of where the emissions are and where they're going. C12 takes a step toward domesticating those obligations. So in many ways, there is emerging alignment between those international reporting obligations and creation of similar obligations on the domestic front. And so it's not a negative thing that in many cases, this may be a cut and paste job of taking what's being submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat and putting it in the plans and in the reports required under C12. And I think that's a good thing. Reduces the reporting burden, but also aligns and puts right on front and center domestically what Canada is doing or perhaps not doing.
Let me turn to you, Ms. Peel, because MP May raised a question about just transition, which I wanted to expand on a little bit. One of the things that we've seen with the advisory body, we've gotten a lot of diversity, and also with the addition of Hassan Youssef. I'm wondering what do you think the importance of labor is and having a seat at the table when we have that just transition, so it doesn't leave anybody behind?
Sure. I mean, workers right now are already feeling the impacts of climate change, and we see just transition as really both a matter of fairness, but also a driver of ambition. And so I think sometimes we think about just transition in very sort of loose ways, but workers at the table developing plans with employers and governments, that that is the path to being more ambitious. So labor at the table developing these plans is critical, and we know that when we talk about just transition, it is not about slowing down progress. It is about making sure that we have the ability to go as far as we need to, as fast as we need to avert the worst impacts of climate change.
That's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that point. I want to elaborate because that was my second question, is how do we have that seamless transition for workers without slowing down the necessary steps that we need to get to net zero as quickly as possible?
Well, there are multiple ways to do that. And, I think much of that could be done in a Just Transition Act, where you sort of look at sector by sector how you actually develop those plans. But, we know that it's possible for employers to make the decision that we're going to transition into 100% renewable, for example, and we're going to start from a position that there'll be no involuntary layoffs. If you want to come with us, we will make sure that you have the skills and the training and the ability to come with us into this new new emissions reduction world. And so, decisions that we make now will really impact whether, and then the other piece of that is, of course, is making sure that the new jobs, as we invest in emissions reductions, are good jobs with decent labor standards and that they're good quality family supporting, community supporting jobs. So, we want that. And people just want to, when you ask workers about what just transition means to them, they want to know, where are the new jobs? What do I need to access those jobs? And, where's the place for me in this new net zero economy?
Okay, that perfect segue to Mr. Heaps, if he's available, Chair.
Well, yeah, sure. He hasn't given his testimony, but go ahead.
Can I ask Mr. Heaps a question?
Of course you can. Go ahead, Mr. Heaps.
So, Mr. Heaps,
go ahead, Mr. Saini, for Mr.
Yeah,
Heaps.
I read an article that you had written, I think, last year in June. And one of the things you mentioned in that a unified federal strategy would unleash almost $30 trillion worth of opportunity. Can you kind of elaborate on the economic opportunities to make sure that businesses are well prepared when Bill C-12 gets implemented, and what are the opportunities for Canadian business, and why is such a unified federal strategy very important to access those opportunities?
Pretty briefly, please, Mr. Heaps.
Sure. So the top three opportunities, first would be in the green
Could you
buildings.
hold your mic up further so we get less echo? There's a mic there, eh?
It's here in my lips.
I think it's a bit better, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, sorry. So thank you for the question. Top three opportunities would be, this is not obvious for everyone in the building sector. Canada has 12 of the top 50 landlords in the world by the largest commercial real estate investors, starting at Brookfield on the way down, in large part because of our strong pension funds that are invested. And we have the ability to export this low carbon building technology through these portfolios that exist in Asia, in Latin America, in North America. It's a huge opportunity for us to export our green building prowess, number one. Number two, within the land, Canada's a huge land mass, both on the forest side and on the agriculture side. And the world is hungry for sustainable food. We have a big opportunity to turn our agriculture sector into a carbon positive source of food. And lastly, on batteries, huge opportunity. We have all the raw ingredients for the batteries.
Yeah, we're a bit over time. So, okay, so Madame Posey.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, before taking the time that I have for myself, Mr. Heap's microphone does not allow for interpretation. I'm sorry. I'd like to know if Mr. Heap is going to go into the next panel with a new microphone, or is it going to be part of this panel? Well, it was supposed to be after this round, but we wanted to give him some time. So I'll be able to ask him questions in the second panel? Okay, thank you. Well, now you have time now. Okay, thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Wright a question. In November, you said that you looked at a parliamentary review of C6, and you talk about the impossibility of tying future legislation because of our Westminster system. And you talked about a solution to put, and that was to say to put 10 sub 3 into 10 sub 1. Would there not be some other solution that under the European Burden Sharing Agreement? Is that something, that agreement, that could be useful to us here?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So there are kind of two levels of thinking along the lines of binding in this context, and that's not a particularly helpful concept here, but let's tackle it. So first of all, this statute is legally enforceable, and that's represented or indicated by the mandatory provisions throughout. Although just like any law that the federal government enacts, it's open to a subsequent federal government to repeal that act, just as we saw with the initial federal environmental assessment statute. So in that way, future governments can repeal, just like CAPIA as well. Yeah, but on the latter, more perhaps more interesting and more practical level, this statute can only go so far because it cannot impose emission reduction targets or specific budgets on a province by province level. Rather, the elephant in the room in Canada for decades has been lack of formal agreement between all provinces, territories, and the federal government with respect to who is going to reduce emissions by how much. So one option is to adopt what the European Union has adopted, which is in some realms called a burden sharing agreement. Today, typically called an effort sharing agreement. Sounds a little less scary, a little less burdensome. But either way, that is a negotiated agreement where all those jurisdictions, so in Canada, that would be all subnational jurisdictions, i.e. provinces, indicate explicitly what their contributions are going to be to emission reductions. So another way to think about it is it's almost like a mini Paris Agreement within the Canadian Federation. And that you can't set that out in Bill C-12. You can create sort of like a portal that recognizes that might be happening. That would be could be included in, for example, 10 sub 1 and information about provinces and territories. But you can at least create the platform and consistency for that kind of burden sharing agreement. So last thing I would say is this is almost like a pan-Canadian framework, circa December 2015, but with emission reduction targets that's signed by all jurisdictions.
Thank you. Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Ms. Peel, following on the questions of my colleagues around just transition. The federal government promised a Just Transition Act at the same time as the climate accountability legislation, but we've seen very little progress towards that. When the minister appeared before this committee last week, I asked him a question, and in his answer, he was quite non-committal about the current status of that initiative. He did allude to some conversations and consultations going on with with labor. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, have you seen any sort of movement or progress on the government side that gives you a sense that they're serious about bringing forward a Just Transition Act as promised?
Well, it's difficult to speak to intention. I will say, yes, there are discussions happening, conversations happening. It likely would have been preferable to have these two pieces of legislation proceed in tandem, so that we have the milestones which drives the just transition, and the just transition which drives the ambition to reach those milestones. I think that is the sort of ideal way that it would work. You know, at this point, it exists in minister's mandate letter. I certainly know that my boss is in discussions frequently, but there isn't, to my knowledge, any move to formalize that introduction of that legislation. So, you know, that promise, I think, was very meaningful to workers, and it was meaningful to people in the labor movement who care a lot about climate ambition and want us to get there and want us to know how fast and how far we have to go. And the challenges of not having concrete just transition plans is that, of course, people are vulnerable to those forces that would have us slow down and turn back. So as I said, it's hard to speak to intention, and there are certainly conversations happening, but yeah, we look forward to seeing this legislation.
Oh, sorry. Which other jurisdictions, which other countries have really led the way when it comes to just transition?
Well, I would say that, you know, Canada certainly took a leadership role when we implemented the Just Transition Task Force for Canadian coal power workers and communities. And as you know, that was co-chaired by CLC President Hassan Youssef. I was fortunate to sit on that, to be a member of that task force, and going and meeting with these workers was very meaningful. So, you know, I don't want to talk too much about that project. It's a different project, but it's important. There's still work to be done on the recommendations of that task force. Scotland is doing some interesting work on just transition. New Zealand is doing some interesting work. You know, there certainly are very specific sector examples, even in Australia. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, that gives us an idea. Mr. Albus.
Mr. Chair, I also will be sharing my time with Elizabeth May, if I could just pass it to her.
Of course. Ms. May, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. Coming back to the question of justiciability, I want to go to Professor Wright on this. It's a pretty modest change, but one of the amendments I'm thinking of bringing in would be just to change that the minister must meet the target. Now, I would like your thoughts on that. It's not a full framework for how you hold the minister to account, but it would set up the possibility for at least going through administrative law to federal court for mandamus. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that, or if there certainly are more elaborate ways that other countries have brought forward, but as a modest amendment, what would you think of that?
Thanks for the question. Yes, in the absence of dedicated provisions that provide an avenue for judicial review and remedy, that's a decent option. And it would signal to the courts that there is an overarching duty to meet the targets. There are a couple caveats, though. One is it is difficult for the federal government to include such a blanket provision because it implicates the provinces, and it's quite clear that the federal government cannot completely go it alone. So some qualifying language in such a provision that says something subject to constitutional constraints, or by take all federal measures necessary, or something to that effect, may be helpful, and it would also. Sorry, last point I would say is, of course, in the justiciability, the courts will read the statute in its entirety. And so a provision like that, even if it's far away from the rest of the other relevant provisions, will signal to the courts an intention of the legislature to have judicial oversight.
Thank you. If there's time, I'd like to ask Professor Lacarré about the way the EU goes about what Professor Wright mentioned earlier as effort sharing or burden sharing. It's always struck me as remarkable as a Canadian climate activist since the mid-1980s is how long I've been working on this. So I'm a complete and utter failure. But what we've seen is that we come back from Kyoto or we come back from Copenhagen and don't actually put together a national plan, whereas the EU comes back and says, okay, who'll do what? Let's split this up. Let's get it done. Can you describe the EU process and how they've managed to do so well as a collection of nation states in observing a target that applies to the whole bubble?
Yeah, absolutely. So the EU process is very much mimicking the Paris Agreement itself, which is that they have their central objective, which is pushed by the different nations as what is seen as the fair contribution for the European Union. And then countries are invited to say and argue why it is that their contribution is going to be such and such. And it's in this argument that countries set their basis for why they should have the target, above the target, or below the target. And then this is negotiated afterwards as a process. And giving the countries themselves the voice to argue their case is very powerful in that respect.
Mr. Chair, do I have time for another quick one?
You have a minute and 40 seconds.
Fantastic. Okay. I'll go to Professor Wright then. It's certainly one of the mysteries of our federation as a confederation of Canadian provinces, territories, and the federal government, that we're not as able to split out the responsibilities as independent nation states within the European Union. And this has been a historical weakness. In looking at C12, and I really support your amendment to bring in 10 sub C into the list of things about which we must report. Can you think of other means that we can, perhaps modeling on the EU, to ensure that our provincial, territorial, and I would also think municipal order of governments need to be involved in saying this is how we take apart this challenge and get at it at each order of government?
Thanks for the question. So again, it is difficult to build that within the four corners of a statute like this. The best you can probably do is make sure the statute is consistent with it and has some kind of portal or crosswalk to some kind of Canadian emissions effort sharing agreement that runs in parallel. The risk in trying to incorporate some requirement to achieve some kind of effort sharing agreement within this statute is that, and this is a bit cynical, but you'll appreciate it, it would build in a veto. So if this act required the federal government to execute some kind of effort sharing agreement with all provinces, any province would then immediately be able to say, we're not going to sign it, we're not going to engage.
Thank you. Our time is up, unfortunately.
Thank you.
We'll go to Mr. Baker.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I'd like to direct my questions to Professor Wright as well. And Professor, I really wanted to kind of continue along the lines of where what you were just speaking about, really. Earlier in response to one of the other members of the committee, you spoke about this burden sharing agreement, or a Canadian Paris agreement, as you alluded to. And I like that analogy. To me, one of the things that it highlights is the challenges in coming to that agreement. You know, we all know how difficult these global climate agreements have been to come to, and how, in many cases, many folks have felt they haven't set the bar high enough. And so, how do you have any thoughts on how we could build that sort of agreement? You know, I say this in the context of, you know, we saw recently what happened where, in the context of the price on pollution, where there were legal challenges from some provinces that ultimately went to the Supreme Court. So wondering about your thoughts on how practically could we come to such an arrangement that's ambitious enough to support what we need to do to reduce emissions.
Thanks for the question. It's the quintessential easier said than done situation. And but we haven't really tried in a meaningful way, at least not in the last decade. So commencing that conversation across federal, territorial, and provincial governments is the important first step, putting those numbers forward. And you could even have a first go in a Kyoto-like pledge system where everyone comes to the table and says, look, this is what's possible. What's different now than a decade or so ago, including under the Kyoto Protocol Implementation Act, is you do have clear federal policy, federal intentions that are aligned with this act, but you also have an emerging recognition right across the country, including in the West, that we are, like it or not, on a path to decarbonization. All one has to do is look at the IEA report from just a couple of days ago. And so, I mean, the fundamental difference between Canada and somewhere like the EU is the economic makeup of the country. And Canada's oil and gas sector is such a significant part of the economy that it has made that conversation a non-starter. Well, that is changing. And everyone recognizes that right across the country. And so the table really is set to have that conversation toward that kind of effort sharing agreement in a way that it hasn't been before. That may sound a little bit rosy, but really there's not much other option. It's time to tackle the elephant that's plagued Canada's implementation of climate commitments for decades.
I appreciate that very much, and it may be rosy, but I appreciate that the degree to which you're more optimistic now than you would have been 10 years ago, and I appreciate that that you underlying the direction that we're moving on this, and where folks across the country are moving on this. So I appreciate that. Wanted to change gears a little bit and talk about targets, and I guess one of the things that I wonder about is, you know, there's targets that are set out in this, or the need for targets to be established that's set out in this legislation, and as I think about the setting of targets, no matter who the government may be who's setting that target, it's one thing to set a target, it's another thing to deliver against it, and so. And there's a tremendous amount that has to happen, and you've just talked about the complexity and difficulty working with the provinces to achieve that. But even if we separate that out for a moment and focus on the federal government's role, what's within the federal government's mandate, there's a tremendous amount that has to be done and planned and organized and coordinated. And so, just wondering about your thoughts on in this bill, the timelines that are set out for targets to be set. What are your thoughts about you know, the time horizon, every 5 years sort of time frame? Is that appropriate? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't disagree with a lot of the submissions you've heard on that, which is 5 years okay, but there ought to be 10 years, but also that it's an iterative process, and of course those targets can be amended. What to me has been a little bit lost in some of the evidence before the committee is that there is an embedded target in the statute, which is net zero by 2050. It's a long way away. It's ambiguous. It could introduce unlimited use of offsets, which may be problematic, but it's at least there. And there are requirements essentially to be on track towards that throughout. So that's a good thing. There is no open-endedness. And so it's all engineered toward that ultimate endpoint, which is a good thing. Now, provisions could be more prescriptive and detailed with respect to making sure we do get there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, good. So I want to thank all the panelists. We're going to take about a 7-minute break. We'll reconvene at 4 p.m. In the meantime, the clerk will reconnect members of the next panel. Mr. Heaps will stay on the line. Again, thank you for your contributions and for a stimulating discussion. So I'll just mute my mic and shut off my video here, and we will gather again in about 6 minutes. Thank you. Welcome to the second half of our meeting today. We have with us as individuals Dr. Madhur Anand, professor at the School of Environmental Studies and director of the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research at the University of Guelph. We have Dr. Sarah Birch, associate professor, Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo, and executive director of the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change. From the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, we have Dr. Aaron Henry, Senior Director, Natural Resources and Sustainable Growth de la Fédération.
From the Fédération des Travailleurs et Travailleuses du Québec, we have with us today Mr. Denis Bolduc, who's the General Secretary, and Mr. Patrick Rondeau, the Union Advisor, Environment and Just Transition. And from the Trottier Energy Institute, Mr. Normand Mousseau, Professor, Department of Physics, University of Montreal. And he's the scientific director there. And also we have Mr. Toby Heaps. So I think I'll start with Mr. Heaps because he's been waiting for some time for these openings, to make his opening statement. Mr. Heaps, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to make two general brief points. The first point relates to reporting, and with respect to Peter Drucker, the management theorist, what gets measured gets managed. So helpfully, this act includes a provision for the Minister of Finance to issue an annual report regarding the federal public administration preparedness and management of the risks and opportunities of climate change. I think it would be a major improvement for this part of the act to be clarified so that it explicitly includes the Bank of Canada, major pension funds in the federal remit, including the PSP, the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, and the Canada Post Pension Plan, among other Crown Corporation pension plans. And I would encourage more guidance on what that report should include. It should include, in my view, an assessment of those institutions against the same target that we're holding Canada to, which is the net zero target. Below 2 degrees is close to 1.5 degrees if possible. Benchmarks exist for assessing these institutions against these frameworks and these levels, and it would be a big shot in the arm for all of these institutions.
Mr. Chair, okay, I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Chair. There's no translation for our members.
Okay, so then we'll have to stop there. I think you said you had 2 points to make, Mr. Heaps. Those, I think, were the 2 points, were they not?
No.
Well, we don't have, unfortunately, we don't have translation, so we're going to have to keep
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, I think so. How do the interpreters feel about this? Well, let's try it and see what happens.
Okay, thank you. And so the first point is for the Minister of Finance annual report to include the federal financial institutions that I mentioned. And the other subpoints of the Minister of Finance annual report is to also include the percent of major suppliers to the federal government who are net zero aligned. There's about.
Excuse me, I have Mme Posé who has her hand up. Je n'entends pas Mme Posé.
Oui, c'est ça, je l'avais levé tantôt, tu sais, puis bon, elle est restée levée, mais je veux dire, c'est toujours pour le même problème.
Ok, mais on entend mieux. Est-ce que vous avez une interprétation?
Non, il y a toujours.
Okay, but do you hear better? Is there still interpretation? No, I know that Mr. Heaps has very many interesting things to say, so I am a little frustrated. That's okay. I think that he had a chance to say 2 things.
Interpretation, and the committee can only proceed with interpretation. So we're going to have to stop here.
I could confine it to 30 words if I can have 30 more words.
No, I don't think. I think we'll have to just stop there. Unfortunately, because the interpreters they can't hear properly. So I'm sorry about that. Monsieur Monsieur Madure.
Ms. Madure, Madame, and Professor School.
Well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all the members of the committee for this opportunity, and a special hello to MP Lloyd Longfield. My name is Madhur Anand. I am a professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph. My own research has examined the impacts of climate change on ecosystems in Canada and worldwide, and also how human behavior and social dynamics can determine the success of climate change mitigation. Our research, some of which was just published yesterday, shows that a growing number of national level climate agreements can tip the balance towards achieving global targets. I'm also director of the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research, where researchers across all 7 of our colleges, engineers, ecologists, mathematicians, artists, and economists are all working on the interdisciplinary challenge of climate mitigation. No one group or sector will be able to solve it on its own. Canada has not met its obligation to reduce emissions according to international climate agreements, and this may very well be because we lacked legislation such as Bill C-12. Research on over 100 countries worldwide shows that passing a new climate law is correlated to reduced emissions. So there's hope here. This act is essential. The remainder of my comments have to do with Section 10 of the bill, the contents of the emissions reduction plan. This is because we simply cannot afford to reach Section 16 of the bill, failure to achieve targets. We know that time is short to head off a cascade of climate tipping points, and the nation isn't going to get a second chance to do this right. Regarding targets, which is in Section 10A, the bill proposes using the best scientific information available. Emission targets will be very hard to detect without sustained scientific work in measurement, monitoring, and modeling. The unaggregated data collected by various sectors needs to be accessible to both scientists and the public. Regarding scenario planning to meet the targets, assumptions about human behavior and societal uptake of technological change must be very explicit and realistic. Our own research shows that social learning, incentivizing behavioral change, and evolving social norms can influence the projected peak of global temperature by as much as 1 degree Celsius. Emissions targets need to account for both social-cultural processes and political speed bumps. This could also include consequences of missing targets early on, effects of which will be cumulative and even harder to mitigate. Regarding Section B, description of key emissions measures, Canada needs to see the writing on the wall. A fossil fuel-free global economy is inevitable, and the sooner Canada acts, the easier it will be to participate in the economy of the future instead of languishing on the past. We have evidence from over a dozen measures that have been effective in other countries at reducing emissions for the energy sector, and much of this technology already exists. Here, I want to focus on some other measures that are usually overlooked, namely land use changes, including sectors of agriculture and forestry. Measures need to include not only just new emissions, but also carbon sinks. In other words, the way we manage cover crops, grasslands, peatlands, forests, and avoid land degradation. These are all things that can help us achieve our targets. But alas, no new political or scientific measure can succeed if it does not have social approval. And this brings me to my comments for sections 10C and D on strategies. Rapid societal change is possible. We have seen this in the pandemic of how willing the public and the private sectors are to work together for a common goal and adopt new behaviors if they understand the risks and the benefits. The strategies should therefore demonstrate the economic, social, and environmental benefits of emission reductions so people in sectors can see the net benefits for Canada. In developing its strategies, the government must consult with not only natural scientists and economists, but also social scientists and those working across the arts, both within and outside of academia, and with Indigenous groups, all of who are able to help us change the language, change the culture, and change the narrative around climate change mitigation.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much. 5 minutes on the dot. Dr. Birch.
Hello, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today at this critical turning point in the history of Canada's response to climate change. My name is Dr. Sarah Birch. I'm an Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair of Sustainability, Governance and Innovation at the University of Waterloo. And I'm also the newly appointed Executive Director of its Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change, which is a hub of over 100 faculty, scientists, and students who explore the unfolding consequences of climate change and the solutions to it. I'm a lead author of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, which, as you know, is currently underway. This is the largest scientific collaboration of its kind, and our assessments directly inform international negotiations on climate change, as well as national, provincial, state, and even municipal climate change planning around the world. As a person who focuses on transitions to low carbon resilient communities, I'd like to take this time to add my voice to the chorus of scholars, advocates, business leaders, youth, Indigenous knowledge holders, and decision makers who know that Canada can demonstrate real leadership on this issue. None of this will be new to you, but I'd like to clarify what we know for sure. We know that climate is already changing. This isn't a problem for other people elsewhere at some distant point in the future. We know that our own activities, the burning of fossil fuels, is largely responsible for those changes. Impacts like flooding, stress on ecosystems, loss of species, drought, extreme weather events, heat waves, and fires, we're seeing evidence of these impacts now here in Canada. This is a human issue, not simply an environmental one. Marginalized communities will suffer the most under a changing climate. And we have seen this as COVID has unfolded. Pre-existing inequalities were exposed and deepened as the pandemic unfolded. So where to from here? The ambitions set out in the Paris Agreement will not be met without transformative levels of greenhouse gas reductions in synergy with actions that protect us from the impacts of climate change. Incremental greenhouse gas reductions, such as those obtained through modest efficiency gains in a system still fundamentally dependent on fossil fuels, will not lead to reductions of the pace and scale required to constrain warming to 2 degrees or less. As we know, between 1990 and 2019, Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions increased by around 21% and decreased only by about 1% between 2015 and 2019. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, however, has clearly demonstrated that we have to cut emissions in half by 2030 if we're to avoid the most costly and irreversible effects of climate change. Given Canada's historical contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and our exceedingly high per capita emissions, it's our responsibility to meet and exceed this call by the IPCC. The UK, for instance, pardon me, has pledged to reduce greenhouse gases by 78% by 2035 in fulfillment of the statutory obligations laid out in the 2008 Climate Change Act. This is exciting, but it's not what interests me. Much more important is the progress that they've made so far. Emissions in the UK have fallen by 51% since 1990. Likewise, Germany has committed to reduce its emissions by 65% by 2030, and the US has now recently committed, of course, to a 50 to 52% reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. The stories behind progress in those countries are more complex than those targets would suggest, of course, but collectively, they convey ambition and urgency. But targets, as we've seen, are insufficient. They're not in and of themselves action. Specific, scalable policies and actions are required to deliver on those targets, along with clear mechanisms for assessing whether we're doing what we said we'd do. We have to hold ourselves accountable. Furthermore, the cost of unbridled climate change vastly outstrips virtually any estimate of the costs of transitioning to a low carbon economy. We must, however, recognize that some sectors and communities will bear a larger share of the burden of that transition, In a just transition, the costs of climate change mitigation are shared rather than placed heavily on marginalized communities and workers in certain sectors. These communities can be beneficiaries of the transition to a low carbon resilient economy rather than collateral damage. To pull out specific points in relation to Bill C-12 based on this that I've just presented, my suggestions would be that Bill C-12 should set a clear and achievable 2025 milestone so that we know sooner rather than later whether we're making progress. Legislate a more ambitious emissions reduction target of at least 50% by 2030 to align with those IPCC recommendations. Make clear who's responsible for reaching objectives and exactly how they'll reach them. There's a crucial missing link between objectives and measures. Clearly define a more robust role for the Net Zero Advisory Body to help set those targets, review, assess, and report on progress. And ensure that a just transition is supported federally, explicitly seeking synergies between adaptation, protecting ourselves from the consequences of climate change, and mitigation, dealing with the causes, while lifting the burden of the transition from marginalized communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, Monsieur Henry de la Chambre de Commerce.
Mr. Henry now. You have 5 minutes from the Chamber of Commerce of Canada.
Here before the Environment and Sustainability Standing Committee to share comments on Bill C-12. So thank you for the invitation. For those I've not met, my name is Aaron Henry. I'm the Senior Director of Natural Resources and Sustainable Growth at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. The Canadian Chamber represents over 250,000 businesses through our network. I'd like to start by simply saying, in principle, the Canadian Chamber is supportive of Bill C-12. However, we believe that there are some details within the legislation as it's proposed, as well as mechanisms of execution that could probably benefit from greater clarity and also some improvements to greater strengthen the confidence of Canada's business community in the Act. I would actually like, though, to start simply with what we see as the potential value of Bill C-12. And I think in many respects, it dovetails some of the comments from the other speakers today. If developed well and in consultation with Canada's business community, I think this bill could lend to greater policy certainty in Canada. I think it create stronger and mutual trust among government, business, and Canadians in the pursuit of our efforts to decarbonize. And as many other speakers in this committee have noted on other days, we have a history of setting climate goals and failing to meet them. Not only does this undermine our efforts to meaningfully contribute to global efforts to combat climate change, it poses a risk to Canada's leadership on the global stage and reputation. And it also, from the business perspective, creates a risk for paradigm swings in Canada's policy environment. And this takes place as successive governments introduce new measures and more stringent regulations to close ground on lapsed targets. And that in itself creates uncertainty for an investment environment. It makes it harder for businesses to adapt and cope, and thankfully to know where they stand. And that in turn creates additional financial and political risk for Canadian businesses. As such, in principle, legislation that increases the transparency and accountability in our efforts to achieve net zero has significant value, especially given that we are discussing policy choices that take shape over the span of decades. With that said, the Chamber recognizes the value in making a few improvements or changes to the legislation. I think first is that we acknowledge that climate change has many different dimensions to it. How we approach net zero will have consequences that go beyond simply reducing emissions. There are implications for social inclusion. There are implications for Canada's economic prosperity and labor forces, implications for rural communities, and as some of the witnesses who attended yesterday will attest, even public health dimensions. In short, not all the pathways to net zero are created equal. Some pathways will carry higher trade-offs, others than others. Some of them will achieve the desired environmental outcomes, but at the unnecessary expense of other social and economic factors. So while the goal of reducing emissions falls squarely within the remit of Environment and Climate Change Canada, those other dimensions, I think, demand the attention of other ministers whom those issues fall within their portfolios. And for that reason, we'd like to make the suggestion that rather than the minister approving a 5-year plan, that should actually be a governor and council decision and made with cabinet. At the same time, we are concerned that as described, this legislation doesn't really give full consideration to the economic opportunities and consequences that are attendant to pursuing net zero. The goal of developing sectoral decarbonization strategies has the potential to create closer collaboration between government and industry to ensure greater policy certainty. But there are two gaps currently that I think need to be closed to achieve this. One, there needs to be a clear economic lens built into the legislation. This lens should set perimeters to ensure that the sectoral strategies developed by the proposed advisory body adhere to those parameters, such as economic competitiveness, job creation, the international opportunities for emission reductions, and the potential export advantages in commodities and clean technologies that Canada can leverage. At a minimum, there needs to be an economic lens that makes that criteria through which different sectoral decarbonization strategies are selected transparent and clear for all concerned stakeholders. Second, we feel that a very high task has been placed before the Net Zero Advisory Board. Simply that having sort of 15 people to successfully develop decarbonization plans from multiple economic sectors over multiple years is a big challenge. And I think that challenge seems even greater given the absence of the direct inclusion on the advisory board or through other mechanisms within the Act of industry expertise in developing these sectoral strategies. So our recommendation would be that the legislation be amended to ensure that industry stakeholders, the stakeholders who are closest to the technological and business opportunities to lower emissions for their sector, are given a clear and formal role in developing sectoral decarbonization strategies. Last, we do have some concerns with the scope of the legislation. It's already been, I think it's already been raised, exactly how this legislation will interact with provincial jurisdictions and the climate ambitions set by provincial governments. It would be helpful if there were some amendments that would clarify how the targets set by provinces will be integrated into this act. That'll be critical in collaborating offset policy, carbon credit creation, and it'll be very important to ensure greater technological certainty around technologies that are eligible for offset creation and pass the test of additionality. Without strong coordination.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. Alors, on passe maintenant à la Fédération.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to the Fédération des travailleurs et travailleuses du Québec. I don't know if it's Mr. Bolduc or Mr. Rondeau who's going to speak, or are you going to share the 5 minutes? That's up to you to decide. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Denis Bolduc, General Secretary of the FTQ. It is my union advisor who's here with me, but I will do the presentation. Thank you to all the members of the committee. The FTQ includes 60,000 members in all regions, in all sectors of economic activity, and in all regions of Quebec. Among our members, we have people in all industries, and some are the most carbon intensive, including cement plants, steel mills, mining, and so on, and a number of them work directly in the energy sector. And I say this without boasting, but the FTQ is the union organization in Quebec that is the most committed to the fight against climate change. As early as 2013, we opened a think tank on climate change. We have had a standing committee on the environment for several years, and we also have taken part in several parliamentary proceedings in Quebec and in several important events on climate change and the just transition. And since 2015, an FTQ delegation was present at the COP meetings. We will be there again this fall in Scotland for the next one. Canada is committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050, and it is also committed to taking action to counter global warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. The FTQ is pleased with the federal government's willingness to seriously address its intention to respect its commitments. At least that's the intention expressed by Bill C-12. That's what we understand. However, we doubt that the measures contained in the bill will effectively achieve the carbon neutrality objectives. A change of course is necessary. The International Energy Agency published a very interesting report this week. The report tells us that it is possible to reach the objective of containing the rise in global warming to below 1.5 degrees without compromising the economy. That's important if the states commit to a withdrawal from new hydrocarbon production projects. In our view, the energy transition and the achievement of the carbon neutrality targeted by C-12 systematically require a transformation of our economy and also our jobs. The transition must be planned and include those who are directly affected by it. We must ensure that the economic and social rights of workers are respected, that jobs are sustainable and viable, and that communities are sustainable in the transition. Governments must put in place just transition mechanisms in all affected workplaces. Carbon neutrality legislation must necessarily be accompanied by just transition mechanisms that rely on social dialogue. In our view, one cannot be separated from the other. Now for provincial jurisdictions. The issues of jurisdiction, engagement, and constraints with provinces are often complex. It is easy to assume that this will be no different in this case. Canada needs to address this issue quickly, while respecting provincial jurisdictions. The implementation must not be delayed by constitutional wrangling. We suggest that you begin discussions with the provinces right away. Advisory Committee. A word on the advisory committee proposed in the bill. The government needs to be advised in its decisions by a credible and competent advisory committee that is free of conflict of interest. In Quebec, the Advisory Committee on Climate Change is made up of 9 people from the scientific community, 9 people out of 12. That is 3/4 of the committee, and that's totally different from what is proposed in C12. Only 1 person out of 14 would come from the scientific community, while 4 people would come from fossil fuel companies. We are concerned about this. We believe that science should guide government decisions, not corporate interests. The current constitution, the current makeup of the committee opens the door to conflicts of interest. Robust rules to guard against this possibility will need to be adopted. I'm keeping an eye on the time. Accountability now. With respect to accountability, the bill provides for evaluation milestones every 5 years. There is some question as to when the first milestone will occur. A first report card in 2030 for us is too far away. I will conclude by saying that what worries the FDQ the most is the total absence of transition planning. This is a sign that carbon neutrality will be achieved without the workers and their community, and without them, it won't work. It is necessary to include just transition mechanisms in the bill now. Thank you very much, Mr. Bolduc. We'll now move over to Professor Normand Mousseau from the Department of Physics, Université de Montréal.
Hello, I am indeed a professor in the Department of Physics, and it's an honor for me to be here today. I greet all of the members of this committee. I've been working on these issues for 15 years. I was chairing the commission in 2013 and 14 in Quebec, and I was part of setting up the Institute on Climate. So at the federal level, I have worked with Environment Canada to set up modeling in Canada to support decision makers. So I'm working a lot on many different initiatives. And we have also published the Canadian Energy Outlook, the 2nd edition, which models carbon neutrality scenarios, which will be available in a few weeks. And what I want to say in this is that there are huge challenges to achieve the targets that we want, and the absolute insufficiency of the measures that are currently in place in the at the federal level and the provincial level. And we'll never make progress with this. And I would also say that carbon net zero changes everything. We have to remember what the final goal is, which is zero emissions. So all decisions made have to be with a view to that. I also led the Le Climat, l'État et nous initiative to transform environmental governance in Quebec. Unfortunately, it's not on track to achieve its objectives either. And I have worked with several models, looked at several models abroad, and you won't be surprised to find some similarities with in my presentation with what Corinne Leclerc said earlier today. I've worked with her over many years. So first of all, I would say that Bill C-12 is an essential piece of legislation, but it's really insufficient. It has shortcomings that will not allow us to reach our goals. And I want to come back to a few issues. First of all, the issue of data. We want to have reports to say where we are. But for greenhouse gas emissions, they should be, they are rather published currently 2 years after the fact. So it's impossible to lead these initiatives with 2-year-old data. So in this bill, we absolutely must include an obligation to provide monthly, quarterly, at the latest, information, as we do with other essential data in this country. And without that, we're just working in the dark. It's impossible to assess the quality of the measures that we're implementing. And it's going to be a failure. Another aspect, I agree entirely with what Professor Lequerre said about having intermediary milestones. So 5 years, yes, but it has to be done in such a way as to allow countries and investors where we're going to be in terms of regulations. And there are also sectorial sectors that need information much quicker than that. So we can't be too many years behind. And we absolutely have to have better accountability. If this bill has a major fault, it is in terms of accountability. If we can't assess where we're going, and the ability to see what we've done so far will be impossible to identify. And these are recommendations that we made in Quebec, as well as we made elsewhere. We have to make the Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development an officer of Parliament. Why? Because that will give the Commissioner of the Environment the statute of someone like the Auditor General and the ability to assess not just programs, but the relevancy of programs in terms of achieving their targets, and a much more integrated look at the environment, and not just an accounting kind of position such as the Auditor General has. And we also have to have an annual report. Once again, 5 years is insufficient. We've seen abroad, if there's only 30 years for us to reach our goals, we have to make sure that the billions of dollars that we spend every year really allow us to go and move in the right direction. And these reports have to not only include the federal government, but all of what's happening across the country. We have to have more independent advice that's better adapted. Currently in Canada, we have the CCCI and the Carbon Neutrality Advisory Group. So they could work together, but currently it's insufficient. The CCCI doesn't have the agility. Its existence is not guaranteed by the law. And the advisory group. Oh, and if I understand well, I've used up my 5 minutes. Yes, that's right. I'm sorry. But you'll have time to make comments and in answering questions. So we'll, at the end, begin the first round with Mr. Albus, I believe.
Mr. Chair, and I'd like to say thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony, your expertise. We certainly appreciate you sharing it with us and with all Canadians. I'm going to direct most of my questions towards Dr. Henry from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Dr. Henry, you seem to saying a number of things. So we've heard Peter Drucker in various quotations or paraphrasing here, and ultimately what gets measured matters. So when you're talking about how right now the plans only look on the emission side and not necessarily on the social or the economic impact side, that creates a bit of a blind spot, because not all plans are equal, I would imagine. A plan could lower emissions, but seriously hurt the economy. A plan could meet our emission targets and grow the economy. So having that balance is an important factor. Would you not agree?
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, this would be our position. Is I think that there's definitely consensus that where we want to go. We want to get to net zero by 2050. there certainly are better ways to do it, right? And there's more cost-effective ways to do it. And I think that that's one of our concerns, is making sure that those considerations are integrated into the bill. I think, one thing that's very clear from the IEA's report and from other, accounting firms and others who've weighed in on this is, well, certainly the costs of not transitioning are incredibly high. And, we need to make that transition. The reality is the upfront capital needed to make an economic transition is also considerable. Right? We're talking, $5 trillion, over the period. I think some estimates are, about $15 trillion alone in terms of new energy capacity, and another $14 trillion in upgrades for grid modernization globally by 2030 alone. And so the key component to that, of course, is you need to be able to develop policy certainty that actually allows for the investment in all those projects. And in many cases, it's upfront capital that gets realized later. It's sensitive to interest rates. There's a whole series of considerations that do need to go into play to actually mobilize that capital. And I think that that's, what we're looking for, is that policy certainty to make sure that the ambition's there, but we're actually getting, below 60,000 feet down to the level that actually allows us to realize how we're going to create the momentum for that. And there's going to be some net zero pathways that are going to leave us positioned to do so, and others that I think won't.
So you did mention the amount, the necessity to have the private sector to invest, because I think the orders of scale of magnitude that I've heard, for example, in our EV study, we heard that we would require 7.5 Site C equivalents to be able to electrify our transportation grid. So would you be in favor of having some sort of assessment of the electric grid in Canada and what steps it can do to manage the increased demand?
I think, I think that kind of study is important. I think those are going to be the types of inquiries that I think are going to have to be made throughout the different sectors of this bill. I mean, when we're thinking about decarbonization strategies, that relates to the resource sector, it relates to buildings, it relates to manufacturing. All of those sectors are going to need to have the kinds of reports that ensure that we're positioning those sectors to be economically strong, to help, carry the burden of that transition, because it's going to come down to a lot of private sector capital to move the needle on these things.
Okay, thank you very much. So, along the theme that not all plans are equal, I would say not all teams are equal. And anytime, maybe it's because I've watched too many Hollywood movies where, sudden action needs to be taken, it's usually a team of diverse views that are able to come together with a better result. Now, that just might be pipe dreams here, but at the same token, it seems to me to have one minister that is going to put 15 individuals forward, to me doesn't seem to be, a proper thing. I would much rather prefer a whole of government approach. Would you much rather see the advisory board? Perhaps you would have, as was suggested yesterday, different ministers suggesting some participants on it. So we have a cross-disciplinary viewpoint from a whole of government approach.
So that's not a recommendation we've formally made, but I think that having different ministers put forward appointees onto the advisory board is a good measure to make sure that you really do get the diversity of perspectives. As said, the transition to net zero is going to have social dimensions, it's going to have economic dimensions, of course, environmental dimensions, and health dimensions as well. And you basically do need to make sure that you have the views in place that allow you to articulate those dimensions in a plan.
My colleague Kathy McLeod has raised during this study a number of times about Indigenous consultation. The government didn't consult apparently with any Indigenous groups, yet there are many First Nation communities that have economic reconciliation agreements that are putting forward their own projects. Do you believe that one of those groups, perhaps one of the Minister for Crown Indigenous Affairs, might be also be able to contribute names towards the panel?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good suggestion.
Okay. So you've mentioned some of the impacts that would happen because not all provinces have the same energy footprints. So you believe that there should be more reporting in regards to some of the impacts on certain regions? And do you also think that there should be a fair summary of all provincial actions towards net zero, given that the federal government doesn't have exclusive jurisdiction in this area?
Rapidement, s'il vous plaît.
So coming to that second component, I think the interaction with provincial governments is crucially important, and I think we've heard different recommendations on what that could look like. I think from the from a business side perspective, one thing that we're hearing repeatedly, and I think is being put forward, is that carbon pricing and the creation of carbon offsets is something that's going to draw in capital into these projects and draw on that interest. It's really important to have close collaboration with the provinces, simply because if there's a shift, you might jeopardize the additionality of those carbon credits. And so being able to actually ensure that net zero strategies and what gets declared business as usual is actually,
we'll have to stop there. We'll have to stop there. Ms. Sachs, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses who have joined us this afternoon. There is much to be discussed and much to learn as we go through this process, so thank you for your interventions today. I was very interested in the comments by both Dr. Birch and Dr. Anand with regards to the societal, if you want to say buy-in or collaboration as we move towards net zero emissions and the impacts that we have to consider in getting societal change to take part in reaching net zero. We are creatures of habit, as I've said many times during this study, and it takes all levels from the individual up to the federal government to make sure that we all work together towards reaching net zero. C12 certainly answers the urgency that Canadians have put forward to us on climate change, and we certainly hope that C12 displays the ambition that we want to put forward, and we appreciate all of your contributions in making sure that we do have the ambition of Canadians as we do this. Dr. Anand, I'd like to circle about what are the impacts we're already seeing on the environment and the ecosystems from climate change, and what will be the ecological consequences if we don't achieve net zero?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Well, these impacts have been, extremely well reported and articulated in a number of reports that the IPCC has put out over the years. In Canada, there's virtually no ecosystem that is not already affected by climate change of the past decades. So I'm not going to give you a big lecture, but I will just quickly tell you a few points. Our northern ecosystems are the ecosystems that are most rapidly changing because there's the most extreme acute effects of warming on those systems. So our peatlands, we've seen melting from frost. Our boreal forests are also seeing increased frequency and intensity of insect outbreaks, which are often exacerbated by stressors related to climate change. Our aquatic systems are seeing stresses in terms of productivity and water quality. The list can go on and on, but essentially we're losing species, we're losing productivity, we are losing carbon sinks that many of these ecosystems provide, which of course comes into this equation. So one of the arguments that I would that I have made in my comments is that it's really, really important to consider the changes we're already seeing, the effects we're already seeing in terms of the urgency, but we're there now. We have an act, so that's good. But it'll be really important in the development of the plans to ensure that we continue to conserve and restore and degradation of those ecosystems, the least of which is because they contribute to carbon sinks. But of course, they provide a lot of other ecosystem services to humanity.
Thank you for your answer. It's very clear in this entire process that we're going through that there are so many levels that are interrelated. We can't just look at one aspect of the puzzle. We need to look at one piece of it. We need to look at all of the pieces. Dr. Birch, I'm a former small business owner, and businesses try to plan ahead and are often faced with challenges is how well do we plan when there are transitions happening on the table. And I know how rewarding it can be to have a business and want to grow and also want to be part of this transition that we're proposing with C12. So as we transition to net zero, how can we support small businesses in the transition and empower them to take advantage of economic opportunities?
Thank you so much for this question. I get the sense that, over the course of our conversations around what to do about climate change for the last decade or two, we tend to focus on what government can do and when we talk about the private sector, it's large corporations for obvious reasons. Greenhouse gas emissions are enormous. are a really important piece of the puzzle. But small and medium-sized enterprises in this country, collectively, individually, their greenhouse gas emissions are small. Collectively, they are enormous. And if they're not supported in the process of the transition, we just will have no hope of reaching these ambitious targets. But what we're seeing in our research is kind of exciting, that the small firms that do see social and environmental good as central to their purpose alongside profit, and sometimes even ranked higher than growth and a sort of dominant profit motive. We're finding that they are implementing greenhouse gas reduction strategies that are much more ambitious and creative than you might see in the larger firms. So we're seeing reductions of 30 or 40% in a couple of years in small firms. So that's exciting. However, looking across the landscape of Canadian small businesses, they lack the capacity. They often have a very fine profit margin. They might not have technical skills outside their clear domain of the good or the service that they provide. And so I think it's crucial to engage those small firms across the country by building capacity for sustainability transitions and decarbonization within small firms, so that they don't fall by the wayside as they have in certainly over the last year and a half related to COVID. So there are technical skills building that's really crucial among small firms, and I think that will help to accelerate the transition.
Thank you, Madame Posey.
Ms. Posey, I'm going to take over. Ms. Michaud, okay. Welcome to the committee. Thank you very much, and welcome to our witnesses. Thank you for being here. I really appreciated your opening remarks. It's refreshing to hear what you had to say, especially when it comes to the economic industries. We're hearing that the economy and all of this is very much interrelated, and you're saying that sometimes the industry doesn't want to get on board, but you're saying the opposite. And if we don't make the transition, if we don't start now, the cost will be even higher. So I'd like to speak to Mr. Bolduc to start. You said that you doubted that we could meet the targets, and I very much agree with you. These targets are very ambitious for carbon neutrality. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have them. Of course, we need ambitious targets, but the way in which we act has to be appropriate to meet those goals. And you really hit the nail on the head. You talked about the International Energy Agency that said that it's good that countries want to meet their objectives by 2050, but they've got to end all oil and gas projects. And in Canada, we know that the gas industry is going to go up by about 15% by 2030. So I don't see how we're going to meet our objectives if we continue in this direction. And with C12, the government does have a responsibility, but industry does too. So how do you see that collaboration happening between the two? Do you think that the government has the right approach with this bill? Those who believe that the future resides in oil and gas, well, they're wrong. If they think we have to wait until we've pulled all the oil and gas out of the earth to act, well, that'll be too long. The International Energy Agency did publish their report. 14 million jobs will be created, and we're going to lose 5 million jobs in oil and gas. So 14 million minus 5, that makes plus 9. 9 million jobs. Jobs created if we head towards the energy transition. You understood correctly. In my opening remarks at the FTQ, well, we think that all players need to be accompanied in this transition. So workers, but also businesses and communities themselves, communities in which these companies are based. It's this approach towards a just transition that we have to implement, and we don't see it in the bill. And you talked about creating an inter-union network for the climate, and you're very proactive, and you've always been very in tune with what the workers need and supporting them, not only with C12, but in its approach for bringing down greenhouse gases. Now, do you think that the government is ready and willing to do what it has to do to take into account the needs of all sectors and all players in the field, including the employees that you represent, the workers you represent? Well, of course, the target has to be higher than 35 or 40%. A number of people put the target at 60%. I would say that it has to be as high as possible, but it has to be reachable. And measures have to be taken with a view to moving towards a just transition. And this has to be a just transition for workers, but also for communities. And there's a Unifor, an affiliate union of the FTQ, which represents thousands of members who are in the oil and gas sector. And they didn't hesitate to ask the government to set their target at 60% by 2030. So I think we have to be ambitious. We have to equip ourselves with what we need to meet those objectives. And if we wait too long, and a number of people have said it before, and we agree at the FTQ, the longer we wait, the more it's going to hurt. Thank you, Mr. Bolduc. I'd like to hear from Dr. Anand on this. I saw you nodding earlier, but you were saying that in C12, the Minister of Environment has to rely on scientists to have their expertise. Now, we talked about 40 to 45% reductions. I think the scientific community is looking more at 60%. Now, the fact that the targets are in the bill itself, is that important? And are those targets sufficient, according to you?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I've unmuted myself. I think the targets, it would not hurt to have them in the bill. I think that a lot of the discussion around what they should be has already been taken. And yes, it's true that if we look at international panels, international agreements, the targets are higher for Canada. And certainly, I agree with the comment that the targets should be achievable, right? So this is a matter for articulating in the plan a target that is achievable. But I think, the higher the target, the better. The higher, the 60% should certainly be what we aim for, and it will just get us there faster. And that way, if we do fall short to the 45, well, it's better than falling below 45. Yeah, in terms of...
Go ahead, another 10 seconds.
Okay, I was just going to say, in terms of hearing from the scientists, yes, this should also be an ongoing discussion. And so in the development of the plans for this bill, we do need to have some more scenario planning, some more modeling that includes the... Yeah, merci.
Okay, thanks. Okay. It's a tough job, to have to cut people off. I feel it hurts me more than it hurts you. Let's put it that. Mr. Bachrach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'll direct my first question to Dr. Birch. Dr. Birch, something you said in your introductory remarks caught my attention. You were mentioning this idea that modest efficiency gains are not going to be enough to get us even to the 2030 target. And it made me think about the way that we talk about the magnitude of change that's going to be required. And the question in my mind is whether the sense of urgency and the way that government communicates to the people of Canada is sufficient to really give them a sense of what's going to be required over the next 9 years, which to me seems like a blink in time. Do we need to be conveying more of a sense of urgency and really being honest with Canadians about what a 45% decrease in emissions looks like in terms of our country? Is that a clear question?
It is. Yeah, thank you. So yes, I would say that we need to be much more creative and, as you say, honest in conveying the depth of change that's required to meet targets of this ambition level. As we all have reflected already many times, we've failed to meet targets in the past. So deep changes are required. And I think that this comes down to essentially our vision of the future. What does a decarbonized Canada look like? And there are lots of different ways it can and should look. There isn't just one vision. And I think that it's really important to open up that conversation so that we have a broader diversity of visions, not just of the end goal, but also of the pathways to get there, so that those visions don't end up being sort of deeply conventional. And I'm concerned that when we talk about what the future looks like, we essentially want to retain exactly the fabric of our communities, the structure of our cities, our lifestyles exactly as they are, but we flick the switch and that power is produced a different way. What we're describing here in terms of a net zero Canada by 2050 is a much deeper transformation than that.
Thanks for your answer. I agree wholeheartedly. I'm curious about the balance between short-term actions and longer-term policies. It seems there are some policies that take years to put in place. The price on carbon, we've been talking about it for many years now, and it's only just starting to take effect. And of course, it will take a while for it to really kick in at levels that make a substantive difference. When we look at a 2025 target, the idea is that we need ambitious action over the next 4 years, which is like a heartbeat. What are the actions that you feel the federal government needs to focus on in order to make a substantial difference in the next 4 years? What are the policy areas that can spool up that quickly?
Thank you. That's a tough question. I really appreciated the conversation that came prior to this that talked about burden sharing between the federal government and the provinces. And I would also add to that, of course, municipalities. There's a crucial role for cities to play here in doing short-term actions to help deal with transportation and residential emissions. We need to start thinking about the fact that every new building that we build has a 30 to 50 or more lifespan, so that every decision we make on the buildings front that locks us into a high carbon pathway is a failure. That's a challenge we have to then undo later on. But it's not just about, in the buildings sector, for instance, those new builds. We have to scale up retrofit of existing buildings to a pace that is like completely unheard of. The existing building stock in residential and commercial buildings have to be transformed within the next decade to deliver these deeper reductions by 2030. So those are crucial. Supporting municipalities that have these tools like land use planning and zoning, provinces that work on the building codes to really target those transportation and buildings related emissions are crucial. Others, Professor Norceau, might talk more to the energy system.
I have a lot of questions about that specific topic you're talking about, home retrofits. I just retrofitted a 1968 split level house to zero emissions heating and cooling, and the process made me think a lot about how far we are from achieving the acceleration and the rate that we need to be at to retrofit, a substantial percentage of the housing stock. And it's a little bit depressing to think about how far we have to go in order to actually really make that happen. But perhaps next I'd like to turn to Mr. Bolduc. You mentioned the just transition, and I'm wondering if you could speak to how you feel Bill C-12 should be amended specifically to reference the just transition elements. And secondly, whether it's enough to add some amendments to C-12 or whether we need the government to deliver on its promise to create a standalone Just Transition Act.
Very quickly, please, Mr. Bolduc. Yes, thank you for the question. Currently in Quebec, we're working jointly with the Conseil du Patronat du Québec in order to convince the Minister of the Environment to set up a task force on the just transition with people like us and, of course, the departments concerned. But this is a component that's very important, I think. for the whole implementation of just transition measures. So at the FTQ, in the front lines, we're trying to organize what we call just transition laboratories. And I'll give you an example. Microbrewery, for example, that we're speaking with. How can we capture the CO2 so that it comes back into the production line to make carbonated beer? Oh, that sounds, to make a carbon neutral or net zero beer. That's a great idea. Thank you.
Where he was going, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, so did I. But there are rules, Mr. Bachrach, even in those cases. We'll go to the second round, starting with Mr. Genereux.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. As much as I'd like to continue to explore that, I have other questions for the witnesses. Do want to start with you, perhaps, Dr. Henry. You got cut off right at your opening comments as you were about to talk about, I believe, the targets set by provinces and how those are managed, and the chair has a difficult job. We've been at this now nine hours, I believe, and then he's doing a good job at managing all this. But hoping that you can perhaps expand on what that provincial element contains.
Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, absolutely. So I think, we've already seen in the design of Canada's climate policy that there are actually a number of policies that get designed federally that do have provincial implications, and in some cases have duplications as well. So a few examples are the work that went into creating methane equivalencies, the cases, for instance, of creating a federal clean fuel standard, and of course provinces that already have clean fuel standards of their own, and then the differences between sort of the federal output-based pricing system as well as provincial systems for heavy emitters. So all those are cases where it's actually quite important to be able to coordinate with the policy frameworks that are put in place in provinces. The one risk, if there's a lack of coordination, of course, is duplication, and you end up regulating and essentially pricing in some cases the same molecule twice, which of course is a challenge, and also goes back to these principles of accounting, skews that. But the other issue that I think we're sort of trying to see ahead on is that, there is a lot of growth here in terms of trying to establish carbon markets. And one key component of carbon markets is we do need a national protocol that makes that clear in terms of what are the conditions to create an offset credit. And one thing that does come into play then is, of course, lists of technologies that are included in a base business as usual scenario and therefore are not considered able to produce additional carbon credits or emissions simply because they're going to happen anyways because that technology has been tagged, versus technologies that are eligible for credit creation. And if there isn't certainty around that between the federal government and the provinces, that actually creates a lot of risks for the investment environment. You're going to have a hard time attracting companies based on that portion of the business model if there isn't certainty that those carbon credits are going to be something that can be guaranteed and recognized by both provincial and federal governments, for an example of the potential complexities there.
And that kind of transitions into what I thought was your other point, hoping you can expand a bit on, is that paradigm swings in the policy making and the potential financial and political risks. I think you touched on a bit in your opening comments, but we can expand a bit more so we have some good balance and testimony to go from.
Absolutely. So I think I think when we approach something like Bill C-12, I think that's something that everyone is looking for in the business community. They're looking for more confidence in terms of what these decarbonization strategies will look like, and they're looking at the ability to sort of know what sort of emission reductions they're going to have to make as an industry, and then of course as an individual company. And I think I'll be honest, this is one thing that's kind of stuck with this conversation is sort of these, like, let's set the limit as high as we possibly can. I think that's great for an ambition side, but that's really challenging policy for any company to kind of know what they need to do to actually, meet those regulations and make those reductions if it's simply going to be sort of a swinging or moving target. I think that the challenge that we face is, of course, if the measures are not in place and agreed upon and we can't actually achieve them, you might find that more stringent measures get introduced by a successive government that's playing catch up on sort of the mandated target. And if you get into that world, it means that, as said, the policy environment is going to change radically. So I think, we've been very happy to see a convergence around potentially the types of tools that can be used as effective climate policy amongst amongst the federal parties, understanding that different parties might use those tools in different ways, but having that kind of consensus is very helpful, I think, for businesses as they look ahead. But that would be one thing that, when businesses look to something like Bill C-12, they are hoping for greater clarity on that policy regime, and there's not going to be a sudden shift. And so if we're not realistic, it doesn't mean not ambitious, but we're not actually realistic in grounding this in what we can do in these sectors, and instead we're sort of creating just sort of floating targets, that is going to knock business confidence significantly, which means that the capital is not going to be there to make these projects run.
Great. And I think because I gave the chair a compliment at the beginning, he'll have a little bit of leeway in my final 10 seconds here. But I just want to quickly ask a follow-up from my colleague, Mr. Albus's question. Do you think there's merit in amending the bill so that Cabinet makes the decisions on terms of who belongs to the panel, and go a little bit further, so including departments like industry, labor, and finance at the table?
Quickly, please. Yes, sort of a yes or no thing.
Yes.
Okay, good. Mr. Biddle for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to turn to the FTQ, and perhaps you can expand on your carbon dioxide and beer answer. Because my question is in regards to, and allow you to explain more about the role that labor will play in the path to net zero, and what are the opportunities that you're seeing for your members?
Yes, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'll let my colleague Patrick respond to that question, because he's very present on the front lines. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The opportunities are connected to the just transition. It's a simple question. That's why we want stringent mechanisms for this that would be within, or that would accompany this legislation. We want the principles of just transition to be mentioned within a bill, and this was promised in the past by the government. They committed to that before the last elections in order to facilitate the transition for workers, with a social dialogue and bringing them to the table by clearly identifying the process and the necessary funding, and by also setting out criteria for success. And all of this can be done by allowing the participation of workers. And that is what we have been saying. If we set the bar that high, if workers aren't part of the solution, they will become the problem. And often the just transition is associated with a principle that prevents energy transition, but it's absolutely the opposite. As soon as we promote and encourage the participation of workers, we will achieve that our other transition much more quickly. And last example is in Saskatchewan. There were workers who were retrained, and so we just have to change the paradigm, and we'll manage to do something great.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn to Dr. Henry. And this is kind of a broad question, and feel free to expand. But do you agree, and I know you've touched on this, but do you agree that more information through the reporting process will be helpful to Canadian businesses as we move towards net zero?
I think more information is always helpful. Of course, it has to pertain to the details of what that information is going to look like. I think that it's also, though, it's the input that I think we're really trying to put stress on. And that I think that when you look at sort of an advisory body that's being proposed, I think it's going to have the ability to get to that 100,000 foot level, right, in terms of its recommendations and what it's thinking about and how it will sort of plan the decarbonization strategies. The reality is, I think, to actually make these reductions in a way that maximizes the efficiency of the reductions, ensures good jobs, ensures sustainable communities, means that you're going to have to include the people who are in the industry, who know what the business model looks like, who understand how the technologies can be applied. And so, information out is great, but I think there is a need for a consultation process so that the people who are going to be managing these different industries through these strategies are heard and are actually able to kind of communicate, what would need to happen to be able to scale some of these technologies or change these business models in a way that, moves us towards these goals. And I think that that's something that isn't clear right now where business is going to come in, and maybe an economic lens into legislation will help encourage that kind of input.
Thank you so much. And moving on to Dr. Anand, I really liked your suggestion in terms of consulting beyond academia, that society needs to be consulted in a broader way, especially because when I watch it anyways, in terms of the news and speaking with constituents, there seems to only be a narrow focus on a few issues. So I was wondering if you could expand on your thoughts and with respect to your comments on a further consultation and consulting beyond academia.
Yeah, I think there should be definitely consultation, but also just engagement and communication, and that can be a two-way street and should be a two-way street. So some thoughts I have on that have to do with like looking at how people behave, right? And looking at societal trends and societal changes. And I know that these are things that government and business already do, but there's a lot, I think there's a lot of data that actually can be gained from those domains that can then feed into our scenarios. There's been a few examples, for example, of like unpredictable outcomes of how people might respond to interventions, right? There's a little bit of that in COVID. For the most part, I think the pandemic showed us that the public, I was actually quite surprised at how quickly people responded to the required interventions that had to be taken and the changes in their lifestyles and behavior.
Good.
The same.
We have to stop there. Sorry, we have to stop there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. He's a tyrant. He's also our caucus chair, so he does the same thing to us as well. So I appreciate it.
Sorry about that again, but we were over time. We had extra time. So, Madame Posé or Madame?
Ms. Posé or Ms. Michaud? Madame Posé this time. Thank you. And I'm going to share the 2.5 minutes that I have with Madame May. My question is for you, Dr. Mousseau. You co-published an article recently with Dr. Lecari on governance, to improve governance. But I would just like to know how you, as a scientific expert, did you see the committee's work that was presented by the minister? Very quickly so that I could leave some time for Ms. May. Well, I think there aren't enough scientists around the table. And one structure, it's because these are all volunteers. So when you're a volunteer, you might be paid by a company. It's impossible to be completely independent. So what we've seen in other committees is that there's some honorarium that's given or a salary, and that allows people to say that's my job and I can separate it from others. But another important aspect is that the Secretariat, as it's currently structured, is under the Department of the Environment. So that means it's not independent. So we absolutely need for that committee to be completely arm's length and independent so that they can do their work and be separated from the government. Thank you. Ms. May.
Thank you so much. My question is to Professor Birch, and merci, Monique. I want to follow up what you talked about the UK target being 78% by 2035, but Professor Birch, I just wanted to confirm with you, that's against 1990 levels, correct?
It sure is.
And so compared to Canada with a 40 to 45% below 2005 levels, we're not even in the same, we're not on the same graph, we're somewhere else.
That's right, and neither is the United States. That's basing its targets on a 2005 baseline.
If I have time, I'm in a quandary. If this bill were to pass the way it is now, I think there's a risk that it's actually dangerous because it sets a target at net zero at 2050. Without the near-term target, could this bill actually be harmful?
I think a near-term target is crucial, and the baseline shuffling is one way of obscuring
the level of ambition that we are claiming we're reaching for, and it's easy to lose. It's easy to lose that nuance. But by choosing that higher, that more recent baseline, we're sort of masking all of those years that our emissions were going up, and so that reduction by 2030 or 2050 is much more modest. So I am absolutely of the mind that a near-term ambitious target is an important part of the process.
Thank you, Mr. Bachrach.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Birch, we've heard from several witnesses over the course of the past couple meetings who have urged us to include economic indicators in Bill C-12. I'm wondering what your view is on this.
That's also a big question. So it was interesting to watch the discussion earlier unfold about this phrase that we all toss around of what we can measure, we can manage, or what we can measure, we care about. I think that's an unfortunately reductionist view of the world. I think there are lots of things that are really important to Canadians that we do a very bad job of measuring. The economic side of the transition is an important set of markers, certainly to ensure that those folks whose livelihoods are tied up in a fossil-based economy will be transitioned in a just and equitable way towards a lower carbon economy. But I think that there's more information beyond economic indicators that are important signposts of whether or not we are progressing towards a future that's desirable for Canadians.
What would some of those other markers be, or other indicators that you think would be important to consider?
Sure. Well, I think that indicators that help us understand the health of our ecosystems, giving that voice to non-human nature is crucial. I think it's important to understand equity and inclusivity as one of the dimensions of a transition that we think we are all driving towards. I think public health is a really important indicator as well, as we could not, see that in more striking fashion than we have over the last year and a half. But this brings me back to something that is very near and dear to my heart, which is that I think there's robust evidence to suggest that a transition towards a decarbonized economy can deliver on multiple priorities simultaneously, not just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but many others as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I imagine my time is almost up.
15 seconds time for
15 seconds. I was going to ask Mr. Bolduc about the advisory body.
Well, what is it? What's the question?
Well, I'm just wondering what his ideas are around moving towards expertise versus interests in the makeup of the committee, but I'll ask it down the road.
Okay, very quickly, the expertise or diversity.
How do you ensure the shift towards expertise from interests?
Yeah, just quickly, expertise or diversity.
Mr. Bolduc?
Oui.
Yes. Well, you need scientists on that committee, that's for sure, to guide the government. But we also need a representative of workers, employees, businesses, and mostly scientists. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to pick up right up on that subject. I worked for many years in industry, building things, whether it was farm machinery and then later housing. And one of the reasons I got into government was because I think pretty much it's well accepted that government does things rather inefficiently and slowly. Serves a purpose, no doubt, but compared to business can be very expert at getting things done, just like we were just speaking about. And so, Dr. Henry, I just want to get your opinion on this, because you mentioned an economic lens, and that's what Dr. Birch was just speaking about. Dr. Birch also said that we need skills building in our smaller enterprises and a broad diversity of visions. And on the other hand, Mr. Bolduc said that we shouldn't have any corporate interests on the advisory board, for example. So in order to get the capital released, in order to actually get things done, when we come up with a plan that all of us are so expert at coming up with, the actual execution of that plan and implementing that plan, that's where I believe we need people who are from the business world who actually know how to get things done and can get them done. What is your perspective on that in this legislation? Are we missing that somehow in this legislation?
Thanks so much for the question. I might also just suggest that the dichotomy suggests between interest and expertise is potentially a little bit of a false one. I think there's people who can be experts and also be interested and come from different spaces. So there's no reason why someone from labor couldn't be an expert, and there's no reason why someone who's come from industry couldn't also be an expert, or so on and so forth. So just to put that in place, I think this is sort of the concern that comes into play. Is I'm not quite sure if there is a mechanism here that really does allow for the alignment between whatever decarbonization strategies are developed by the advisory board with the business community that can essentially execute on those strategies. And so there's 2 points there. I think, to be able to execute on the strategy, I think we need to make sure that the strategy itself is granular enough, is couched in where businesses are actually situated, where the opportunities lie, and what can actually be achieved. And so I think that's sort of the recurrent concern that I think we have, is that there needs to be some way to ensure that whatever decarbonization strategies are developed, they're developed with a view for public health. They're developed with a view for social inclusion. They're developed with a view for workers' rights and where they sit, but they're also developed, in consultation with industry who's going to have to carry this forward. And so I would just go back to that point. I think, if you want to get to that level of granularity, I think you really do need to have some type of mechanism that ensures that the advisory board either, goes through a very rigorous consultation process, or that industries are in fact actually represented on the advisory council. If I don't know, potentially if each sort of decarbonization strategy group becomes its own miniature committee. I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism of what that might look like, but currently it's not there.
Thanks. I want to talk to you about you mentioned policy certainty earlier on, and I'm thinking about the most recent goalpost movements that we've seen. We originally had a target of 30%, and then we had a major carbon tax increase, and then the target went to 36, then went to 45. The minister told us that he consulted widely before moving this target from 36 to 45 in that 3-day period there. Did he consult with you or any of your members that you're aware of on those targets moving around?
I can't speak to the members whether or not they were consulted. We were not, and so I think from our vantage point, it was a little bit of a surprise to kind of see the goalposts move overnight. I think, and that's still another element that we'd like to see, is that there's a lot of different companies in Canada that have either pledged net zero or carbon neutral. They're starting to develop their blueprints. There's still a need to bring those plans into closer orbit with the public policy that's in place. And, there's some encouragement with something like the Net Zero Accelerator as a policy plan, but I think there's going to have to be a stronger alignment and coordination between business and industry on this to actually meet these goals.
What are the implications to business when these goalposts change like that overnight?
They're significant. It essentially means that you might have had an emission reduction strategy that no longer meets the goal that the government is setting. It creates ripple effects where there's concerns that says, okay, we've moved from say a 30% benchmark now to 40 to 45%. Well, how's that going to be achieved? Are we going to see more stringent policy? Does that mean that actually certain investments that we've planned and made are no longer as attractive as they previously were? Does that mean that financial markets will not allocate capital to those projects? And on the lower level and sort of down to less gravity, but I think it's even a concern for small to medium businesses that are seeing a carbon price of $170 per ton. These are groups that I think I've mentioned are key to Canada's climate change strategy, but generally don't have the resources and sort of expertise.
Thanks, Mr. Longfield.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been very patient wanting to have my turn, and I've got last turn. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to the witnesses, in particular to Dr. Anand from Guelph. And congratulations to Dr. Anand on your nomination for the Governor General's Award for your book of poetry, recently announced with 2 other Guelph authors. There is a story, and that's where I'm going with this. I have an English degree and math minor, so there is a role for the story. And I think you were just finishing a sentence bridging what we're learning from the story of COVID and how that might apply to climate change. And before I go to the comment that you were going to make, I'm thinking of this advisory board we're talking about in this bill being something like the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, or like the Public Health Agency of Canada, something that's created outside of government to solve problems on behalf of Canadians, but connected to government through some governance. Could you comment on the importance of the stories that we're learning from things like the COVID or the previous pandemic that we went through?
Well, thank you very much, MP Longfield. I mean, one of the things in my opening comments that I said towards the end is that, you know, something that we really need to see is some new narratives for climate change. And the reason for that is because I think that the lack of progress that we're seeing is because we're stuck in old, wrong narratives. You know, we have old-fashioned ideas or wrong ideas about everything from the impacts, but I think most importantly about what the benefits are for moving through, you know, some of the pathways towards net zero. And I think the benefits of that are just not being communicated as well to society. And whether you call that honesty or whether you look for creative ways to do that, it doesn't matter. Just, I think ultimately it's the benefits of that. And part of that has to do with imagining pathways that we can't imagine. And that's something that artists are really good at doing. Right. And so, you know, I think there is a role for that, that group as well here. You know, storytelling is also a very important component, as far as I understand it, with the Indigenous communities. It's a part of their how they manage their systems and sustain their own communities. So it's not I think it's just a very important thing.
Yeah, and in terms of legislation, I mean, legislation does something. It doesn't solve the problems. It creates conditions under which problems can be solved. And I think a lot of Canadians would look to us and say, well, fix it. We can pass legislation, but do it in a way that allows for groups like this advisory board that's being created in this legislation to consider things like Indigenous stories, or what did we learn in COVID that didn't work? Like when politicians got involved and started fighting each other, we had a grade 12, we had a group, a panel of grade 12s, and one of them said to me, if you'd stop fighting each other and fight climate change instead. I mean, politicians are fighting each other instead of fighting problems like climate change. And maybe over to Dr. Birch, just in a very few, or I have a minute left. You alluded to having multiple problems solved through legislation like this. I'm thinking of environmental racism. I'm thinking of helping make sure that this legislation doesn't make a bigger gap between people that have access to clean water and clean air and businesses that can buy clean water and clean air through carbon credits. Could you comment on that, please?
Sure. I would say that, as you say, legislation can't do everything, but it plays a crucial role in framing a problem. And when we bring the justice element and the co-benefits strongly into the narrative, I think we have a better chance of solving those problems. And one way to help do that would be to I put a plea out there to not just have natural scientists and physical scientists on the advisory board, but social scientists.
Thank you. And we do have an intermediate goal with the 2030. We've negotiated internationally. We know that we are making that more aggressive, maybe not as aggressive as others would like to see, but the importance of having intermediate goals and long-term goals, I think you also commented on.
Okay. Merci. Ça nous mène à la fin de notre séance d'aujourd'hui.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our session today. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their viewpoints and for sharing their expertise with us on a matter that is very crucial for our planet and for our country. This has led to a very fascinating discussion. For the members of the committee, this concludes our testimonies on this bill, Bill C-12. Next week, we planned on holding two 2-hour meetings. However, because of all kinds of constraints and unexpected events, we're only going to hold one meeting on Wednesday. It will be a 4-hour meeting. There will be breaks, of course, but it will take place at 3:30 on Wednesday. And we will do our clause-by-clause study of the bill. So on that note, I'll ask if there is a motion to adjourn. All right, so there seems to be unanimous consent. I'd like to say thank you once again to the witnesses. Thank you to the analysts and the clerk and the technicians. Have a good evening and see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
Great meeting.